Hey guys, tonight's story settles into the quieter corners of wartime. No roaring front lines, no uniforms or medals, just a single street where the lights don't work, the windows are taped with crosses, and people still find ways to smile between sirens. This is about the homes that stayed warm when the world felt cold. The laughs that slipped through cracked windows and the hands that shared what little they had. Before we drift fully into that world, if you're enjoying these slow bedtime journeys through forgotten lives, take a moment to gently tap that like button and maybe subscribe only if it feels right to you. Leave a little comment, if you're awake enough, telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always lovely to see how far this little lantern of a channel glows. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some rain sounds in the background, and let's begin our slow walk into the past. It starts with the Kettle. It always does. At the end of Mallow Street, where the pavement narrows and the bricks lean like tired shoulders against one another, sits a narrow house with pale green shutters and a cracked garden gate. The door creaks whether it's opened or not. Inside lives Mrs. Elsie Turner, a woman of quiet habits and warm tea. Her kettle hums more than it boils. It's always warm, never loud. And even now, with ration books tucked in every pocket and blackout curtains heavy as gilt, there's never a time someone couldn't knock and be let in. Only, they don't knock. Not really. The people on Mallow Street just appear in Elsie's kitchen when the sirens fade and their hands are cold. She never minds. She always has enough for one more cup. Elsie is 62, or maybe 63, but the calendar lost meaning after the letter came. The one that told her James wouldn't be coming home. It arrived on a Tuesday in an envelope much too formal, handed to her by the same postman who used to bring her seed, catalogues and birthday cards. Since then, she's kept his chair at the table and pours 2 cups each morning out of quiet habit. The cat drinks from the second one sometimes. Sometimes it just steams gently by the window, untouched. Across the road, tucked low in the coal box like a lookout, is Frankie Simmons. His periscope is made from a rolled tin poster and some scrap mirror, and he's been using it to spy on the lamplighter, who no longer lights anything. Frankie is 10, sharp-eyed and quick-footed, though his left boot squeaks slightly, which he insists is a feature, not a flaw. His mother is stationed near Portsmouth with the nursing corps. His father, he says, is flying planes, though his gran says otherwise in a voice that always trails off into a cough. Frankie doesn't ask questions he doesn't want the answers to. Instead, he builds planes out of broomsticks and cardboard, then dives them dramatically off the back step to cheering crowds only he can hear. Nora Bell, who walks past at sea, 4:45 each evening, never stops to speak. But she always nods. Always. Her boots are heavy, her coat too thin, and her eyes are darker than they were last year. She works at the factory, wiring circuits into casings, assembling tools of war without asking what they'll be used for. She carries the weight of her work in her posture, but slips poetry into her coat pocket like a secret. Little verses scribbled on corners of newspapers, poems about things that haven't happened yet. She reads them on the tram. Once, she smiled at one so much she forgot to get off and had to walk the last mile home. The street itself is like a living thing now. Windows breathe behind blackout curtains. Smells of boiled cabbage, coal smoke, and damp wool drift between houses. Someone's always hammering something. Radios hum behind closed doors, voices hushed, music muffled. And then comes the siren, long, low, rising like a nervous breath caught in the throat of the city. People pause but don't panic, not anymore. They've learned to live beside the sound, like a neighbour who comes by uninvited, too often to argue with. Harry Price, who once climbed chimneys taller than the baker's roof, buttons his coat and shuffles into the street. His helmet doesn't sit quite right anymore, and he's tied his whistle to his jacket with a shoelace. He taps on windows gently, not to alarm anyone, just to remind them. He says the same phrase every night, like a bedtime story for the whole street. Lights tight, hearts lighter. No one laughs, but everyone remembers it. It's his way of telling them he sees them, and he's still here. Behind the allotment fence, tucked between a greengrocer's signboard and a missing cat notice, is the Klein bookshop. The door sticks, and the bell above it hasn't rung in months, but inside it smells of ink and old apples. Ruth Klein lights a candle in a chipped holder and starts to sweep, though there's little left to sweep but dust and memory. Her husband Samuel sits behind a stack of books, mending spines with paste and patience. He hums softly, an old tune from somewhere across the sea. It has no lyrics, or maybe too many. No one asks. Some nights they host quiet gatherings. People bring biscuits wrapped in scarves, and Ruth pours thin tea into thick mugs. They sing songs too soft for sirens to silence. And above it all, above the blacked-out rooftops and smoking chimneys, the sky pulses a dim grey, too thick for stars, too cold for clouds. Elsie moves through her kitchen like someone dancing slowly in her sleep. She spoons sugar from a jar labelled buttons and stirs 2 cups, though no one's joined her yet. The radio whispers static and bits of weather reports. She hums just a bit, a tune she knew before she had grey in her hair and stories in her eyes. Frankie, done with the spying, bursts out of the coal box and startles the milkman's dog. He salutes no one in particular, dashes across the pavement, and slips into Elsie's kitchen as if summoned. He doesn't say hello. He just points to the cup that's steaming and claims it with both hands. Nora, passing by again on her late shift, slows just enough to see the boy through the window. She watches the way Elsie pats his hair, the way the steam curls up around his nose. She doesn't smile, not exactly, but her shoulders drop, and for a moment, the ache in her back feels like something less. Somewhere on the street, a child begins to sing just one line, an old song, and though it's off-key and probably unfinished, 2 other voices join in. The kettle clicks, the siren fades, and Mallow Street breathes again. The next morning begins before it wants to. Winter light seeps through the corners of the curtains like a reluctant visitor. Outside, the pavement glistens with thin frost, and chimneys puff into the grey like sleepy giants. There's a hush that lingers longer than usual, that early morning stillness when no one's quite sure if it's safe to resume living loudly again. But inside Elsie Turner's kitchen, things are already in motion. The kettle sings gently, not boiling, just whispering steam into the air like breath into cold hands. Frankie, still wrapped in a knitted scarf too long for his height, sits on a stool with one leg swinging as he works a crumb out of the corner of his mouth. His face is still smudged with the leftover coal dust from yesterday's spying mission, and his eyes blink slow and stubborn like he hasn't quite let go of sleep. Elsie pours him another half cup of tea, mostly hot water now, with a careful splash of milk that smells faintly of yesterday's tin. She doesn't ask if he's hungry. She already knows the answer. Instead, she pulls a square of bread from a cloth bundle on the counter, slices it thin as her patience, and offers it without a word. He takes it in both hands like a gift and chews, like he's got all morning to finish. They sit like that for a while, just the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional pop from the stove to interrupt their silence. Frankie eventually breaks it. "My teacher says the war's going to end this year," he says, voice muffled through bread and steam. Elsie doesn't respond right away. She wipes her hands on her apron, considers the window, then shrugs. "Maybe," she says. "And if it does, we'll throw a proper tea, raisins and all." Frankie grins. "With real sugar, real cups, real singing. The whole street'll hear us." They both know it's a pretend promise, but pretend is good enough for now. 2 streets over, Nora Bell is rinsing her hands in a chipped basin behind the munitions factory. The water bites at her fingers, sharp and clean. She watches the grease swirl off her skin, lines of darkness peeling away like worn fabric, but the scent of metal still clings. Her shift ended 2 hours ago, but the foreman asked her to stay just for a bit, and she doesn't like saying no, when overtime means an extra egg in the ration slip next week. She pulls on her coat slowly, rolling her shoulders like a soldier after parade, then makes her way toward the tram stop, boots soft against the half-frozen mud. She thinks about the poem in her pocket, folded and refolded so many times the creases have become part of the paper's grain. She hasn't read it in days. She's afraid she'll find it silly now, but she keeps it anyway. Just knowing it's there makes the cold less personal. The tram arrives in a coughing groan of gears and steam, and Nora boards without meeting anyone's eye. The benches are damp, the windows fogged, but it's quiet and that's enough. She leans back, presses her head against the chilled window, and lets her thoughts drift toward the bookshop. It's Tuesday. That means the Kleins will be sweeping and humming and preparing for whatever scraps they've gathered for their little night of song. She hasn't gone in weeks, not since her sister stopped writing, but maybe tonight, maybe just for a moment. Back on Mallow Street, the Klein bookshop is lit by the low flicker of an oil lamp and the morning's pale grey glow. Samuel is unpacking a small crate of books salvaged from a bombed-out library uptown. The covers are scorched, the pages stained, but the words still hold. Ruth sits near the counter, needle in hand mending the elbow of a wool coat that isn't hers. It was left last week by one of the neighbours, a young mother with twins and no time for stitching. Ruth works slowly, carefully, the thread moving in and out like breath. They don't speak much in the mornings. Their words are kept for the evenings, for the songs and stories and shared laughter that warm their narrow shop like firelight. But there's comfort in the silence, in the way Samuel clears his throat just once before reading a page aloud, in the way Ruth taps her fingers twice on the table when she finishes a row of stitches. These small rhythms hold more meaning than any sermon. A bell jangles weakly as the door creaks open. Frankie enters, breathless, cheeks red with the cold and mischief. He's carrying a rolled-up flyer and a button he claims to have found near the postbox. "I think it's part of a spy's uniform," he declares. Samuel raises an eyebrow, gestures to the little armchair by the stove, and wordlessly begins pouring tea into a tin mug. Ruth hides a smile. Frankie has brought 4 buttons this week and 1 perfectly ordinary coin he swore fell from a parachute. Frankie settles in, pulls his scarf up over his nose like a pilot's mask, and starts explaining the latest enemy code he's cracked, something involving the number of pigeons seen on the bakery roof. The Kleins nod along solemnly. They never interrupt. Every theory deserves its moment. By late afternoon, Mallow Street is blanketed in a soft, strange light, the kind that makes everything look like a memory. Smoke from hearths rises low, curling lazily, before it's swallowed by sky. The siren hasn't sounded today. Not yet, and people begin to walk a little slower, talk a little louder, like maybe the quiet will last. Elsie steps outside with a tin of biscuit crumbs and tosses a handful into the street for the sparrows. She watches them flutter and scatter, their wings flashing like paper in the breeze. Across the way, Harry Price leans on his walking stick, helmet tucked under one arm, eyes closed against the wind. He smells rain coming, not a downpour, just the kind that softens everything. "Your birds eat better than I do," he says, without opening his eyes. Elsie snorts. "My birds aren't paying rent." Harry chuckles, low and wheezy, and offers her a square of toffee wrapped in butter paper. She takes it, unwraps it, breaks it in 2, and hands half back. They suck quietly, letting the sugar melt slow, neither of them saying what they're both thinking. That sweets like this might not come again for months. As dusk settles and the windows blink with dim lamplight behind thick curtains, Nora returns from the factory and pauses outside the bookshop. She doesn't go in right away, she listens. From inside, someone is playing a soft tune on a harmonica. Maybe Samuel, maybe someone else. It's shaky, unsure, but warm. She steps in just as the kettle whistles. Ruth greets her with a nod, already reaching for an extra cup. No questions, no explanations, just a seat, a song, and the shared silence of people who've survived another day. Later that night, the siren finally wails. Not the low warning, but the high, insistent scream that cuts through walls and dreams alike. Lights are doused, boots hit floorboards, blankets are grabbed, doors open and people flow out like a slow-moving tide toward the shelter down near the rail line. Inside, the shelter smells of damp stone and oilskin. It's crowded. It always is. Elsie is there, holding Frankie's hand. his toy plane clutched under one arm. Harry is checking the blackout at the far end, pretending not to limp. Nora sits near the wall, her eyes closed, head resting against a bag of laundry. Ruth and Samuel are passing around a tin of biscuits, letting each person take half a piece so it lasts. Then someone, maybe Harry, starts humming. A few seconds later, Ruth joins in. Then Nora. The tune is old, simple, one everyone seems to know without remembering how. It winds its way around the shelter like smoke. People sing quietly, eyes closed, voices uneven but sincere. Laughter comes not in jokes, but in the way a child's giggle escapes when someone sings the wrong verse, or when a whistle echoes too sharply and makes the group break into warm, sleepy chuckles. And for just a moment, beneath the stone and fear and sound of distant planes, Mallow Street becomes something softer. A space between danger and rest. A place where laughter is allowed, even if only in whispers. Outside, the sky is lit with silent flashes. Inside, the kettle whistles in someone's memory. The all clear didn't come until 3:30 in the morning. A thin, shivering whistle followed by a silence that felt too delicate to trun us. One by one, people stirred from their places on benches and stone ledges, gathered their coats, their children, their dignity, and drifted out into the brittle chill of pre-dawn London. The shelter emptied slowly, the way water leaves a cracked bucket. Some murmured good nights, others only nodded. The singing had stopped long ago, but something lingered in the air. Maybe the echo of it, or maybe just the feeling it had left behind. Elsie waited until most had gone before standing, her knees protesting in small, polite aches. Frankie leaned against her side, already half asleep, his toy plane dangling from his hand by a piece of string he'd knotted himself. She didn't hurry him. They moved together like a single figure, pausing only when Harry Price lifted his helmet in a sort of farewell salute and muttered something about the forecast being full of nonsense and east wind. Elsie offered him a biscuit crumb from her coat pocket. He took it with a reverence that made her smile. Outside, the street was ghostly. Windows remained blackened, the horizon the colour of old milk. Smoke curled gently from chimneys like cautious questions. A few houses still had their curtains drawn tight, not out of fear, but habit. People learned quickly not to tempt the skies with signs of life. Elsie's boots clicked softly on the pavement, and Frankie's didn't click at all. He was barefoot inside his socks, which had slipped halfway off sometime during the night, and were now flapping like flags from his heels. When they reached the little green-shuttered house, Elsie paused before opening the door. The sky was beginning to shift from grey to something faintly blue. Not a proper dawn yet, just a whisper of it. The kind of light that made everything look quieter. She looked down at Frankie, whose head had dropped sideways, chin tucked to shoulder. She gently tapped his back and grunted, half woke, and shuffled inside without protest. In the kitchen, the kettle sat on the stove like a faithful dog. Elsie lit the fire with a practised hand, one match and a small twist of newspaper saved from last week's groceries. She set the kettle on, placed a cracked mug on the counter, then pulled out a jar of dried leaves. Not tea, not any more, just something called infusion mix that smelled faintly of burnt toast and lavender. She added a pinch, filled the mug with steam, and set it beside the window. The mug wasn't for her. It was for James. Still warm, still poured, still waiting. Upstairs, Frankie snored softly under a patchwork blanket made from old dresses and a coat sleeve. Elsie tucked it tighter around his small frame, brushed the hair from his forehead, and took a moment to watch his chest rise and fall. She didn't have children of her own. Not that she hadn't wanted them. It just never happened. The war before this one had taken too much time, and this war had taken everything else. She went back downstairs, sat by the window with her own cup, and let the warmth of it rest in her hands. Her fingers were stiff from the night air, and the bones in her wrist clicked when she flexed them, but the tea helped. Outside, the street remained still. A cat appeared from under the Anderson shelter and trotted confidently across the road, tail high, eyes smug. It paused on Elsie's doorstep as it did every morning and waited for its saucer. She obliged. Across the way, the Kleins hadn't yet stirred. Their curtains remained shut, their signs slightly tilted, but the lamp in their front room flickered to life just before 6. Elsie smiled. Right on time. In the small back room of the bookshop, Ruth sat at her table sorting buttons. She had jars full of them collected over years from donations and forgotten coats. Each one had a history even if she didn't know it. Large black ones from overcoats, tiny white ones for baby cardigans, a strange brass one with a rose engraved on it, likely from a uniform of some sort. She didn't need to sort them, no one was asking, but the rhythm of it helped quiet her thoughts. Samuel, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, made tea with a little boiled water and half a spoon of powdered something. It wasn't proper tea, but they drank it as though it were. Later that morning, Nora Bell would walk past their window on her way to the factory. Her boots would be laced tight, her coat freshly brushed, and the poem in her pocket unfolded and refolded again. She'd stop, as she often did, just briefly, and glance inside. Sometimes she caught Ruth's eye, sometimes not, but she always walked a little taller after passing that window. And Harry Price, grumbling about his hip and muttering about how kids these days didn't know a chimney from a stovepipe, would spend the morning chalking notes on door frames. He didn't need to. It was part of his old job, back when the bomb wardens recorded who'd gone into shelters and who hadn't. Now it was just a habit, his way of keeping track, of remembering who still lived behind each door. By noon the street smelled of boiled vegetables and wet stone. Rain had started lightly, the sort of rain that made you unsure whether it was worth fetching a coat. Elsie, standing by her sink, considered stepping out for a bit of bread. The bakery 3 streets over had managed a new batch this week, and the neighbour girl had said there might be some left if you came early. She wiped her hands on her apron, grabbed her shopping bag and told the kettle not to behave too poorly in her absence. Frankie, now properly awake, decided to follow. Not because he cared about bread, but because he liked the way puddles looked, certain you stepped in them hard enough to surprise birds. He chattered the whole way, talking about a new code system he'd developed for detecting spies. This one involved collecting biscuit wrappers and seeing which ones were folded more carefully than others. He suspected the barber of hiding something, though he wasn't sure what. Elsie nodded through it all, offering small hums of interest and occasionally inserting a "well now" to keep the rhythm going. The bakery had exactly 4 loaves left when they arrived. Elsie purchased one, split it in half, and handed a piece to Frankie. He looked at it like she'd given him gold. Bread with crust, real crust. He bit into it immediately and got crumbs all over his chin, which Elsie gently wiped with her scarf. They returned home slower, not because they were tired, but because walking slowly gave them more time to stretch the day between their fingers. The rain had picked up slightly, misting their faces and softening the edges of the buildings. Mallow Street looked softer in the rain, like a smudged charcoal drawing. People were out now, hanging blankets, sweeping steps, children bouncing old balls wrapped in string. It was the kind of day that wouldn't be remembered in any history book, and yet it was the kind of day that people might cling to later when the noise returned. That evening, before the sirens, before the lamps went dark again, before the singing in the bookshop and the nervous shuffling of feet in shelters, Elsie sat with Frankie in the kitchen. The kettle whistled, the rain pattered gently on the roof. The bread, sliced thinly and toasted near the fire, filled the house with a smell that felt older than the war. Frankie picked up a burnt edge and nibbled thoughtfully. "Do you think they'll write about us one day?" he asked. Elsie blinked. "Who?" "The people in the future. The ones with flying cars and robot dogs and whatever." She smiled, reached over and smoothed his hair. "I think they might," she said softly. "Not all of us, but someone, maybe a little boy with a spy kit, or a lady with too many cardigans." He laughed, mouth full of toast. And outside the world kept turning, slow and gentle, just like the steam curling up from the kettle that never truly went cold. There was something peculiar about the smell of toast lingering into the evening, like a ghost of breakfast refusing to leave. The house felt warmer than usual, not from the fire, but from the quiet buzz of a day that had offered more good than bad. Elsie settled in her chair by the window, had a blanket draped across her lap and a half-knitted sock hanging from her needles, the yarn coiled like sleepy smoke on the floor. Frankie had drifted onto the rug with his toy plane, running small fingers along the wings as if he were checking them for damage after a mission. He whispered things to it now and then, words no one else would understand, the sort of secret communication boys carry with their imagination and never quite outgrow. Outside, the last stretch of daylight pressed thin gold through the cracks of cloud. Mallow Street was mostly quiet now, the kind of hush that felt respectful, as though everyone had silently agreed to let this good enough day slip gently into dusk without spoiling it with unnecessary noise. A milk bottle clinked somewhere down the road. A door creaked open and shut. In the distance, the tram rattled like a tired old song making its final verse. Elsie glanced at the mantel clock. She could hear the faint ticks, steady as breath, a sound so soft it had become part of the walls. The bookshop across the street would be stirring by now. Tuesday evenings brought something close to ceremony in their little world. A table moved to the side, cushions laid out with care, a kettle boiled not once but twice. Ruth would be arranging biscuit tins, empty though they might be, and Samuel would be tuning the old harmonica that never quite stayed in key, but always found its way to people's hearts regardless. Frankie looked up from his plane, sensing the shift in energy that came before a gathering. "Is it the singing night?" he asked, already sitting straighter. Elsie nodded, setting aside her knitting with the kind of deliberate care reserved for small sacred moments. "Well then," she said, rising slowly, "best not be late. They say the biscuits taste better if you arrive early." Frankie giggled and pulled on his boots without untying the laces, shoving the heels down with his fingers and wriggling his toes to make space. He never wore them properly, and Elsie had long since stopped trying to correct him. Some things weren't worth taming. They stepped outside into the cool evening, the sky bruising purple above them, and crossed the road together. A soft drizzle had started, fine and silver, the kind that kissed cheeks and made street lamps look like blurred stars. Nora was already there, leaning against the shop front with her coat drawn tight and her chin tucked into a scarf that still smelled faintly of engine grease, and the lavender soap she rationed carefully. She gave them a sideways smile, one corner of her mouth twitching upward, and knocked gently on the glass. Inside, Ruth opened the door with a warmth that couldn't be taught, the kind that came from years of missing and mourning and learning to love again anyway. Her hair was pinned up with care, and she wore her soft grey cardigan with the patched elbow, the one she always claimed made her tea taste better. She ushered them in, her eyes lingering on Frankie a second longer, the way people sometimes do with children they never had. The shop smelled of must and spice, of old paper and candle wax. The walls were lined with books that sagged gently in their shelves, like they too had lived through a dozen winters and still hadn't given up. The table in the centre had been pushed aside to make room for mismatched cushions and folded blankets. In one corner, Samuel sat tuning the harmonica, humming softly as if trying to coax the notes into place with kindness alone. People arrived in quiet pairs. Mrs. Dovey from the grocer's carrying a tin that once held chocolates but now rattled faintly with buttons and dried apple slices. The Murphy twins, their socks rolled down around their ankles and their fingers sticky with whatever they'd managed to scavenge for supper. Even old Mr. Farthing from the corner house, who usually kept to himself, shuffled in with a reluctant nod and a half loaf of stale bread under his arm. They all settled in, not with fanfare, but with the easy rhythm of routine. Someone lit the candle that always sat in the blue ceramic bowl. Ruth handed out mugs of hot liquid that couldn't rightly be called tea, but warmed the hands just the same. Frankie took his place between Elsie and Nora, legs crossed, eyes bright, his toy plane perched on his knee like a guest in its own right. Samuel played first, a simple tune that had no name, just notes rising and falling like the breath of someone remembering something they never told anyone. It wobbled at the edges, unsure in places, but no one minded. Music in wartime didn't need polish. It only needed heart. After the song there was silence. Not awkward, not expectant. Just silence, the kind that settles in when people feel safe. Then Ruth began to speak softly, telling a story about a man she once knew who sold umbrellas that collapsed in the sun but held firm in a blizzard. It made no sense, and yet everyone laughed. Not loudly, not all at once, but gently, as if their laughter had to pass through something tender before it reached the surface. It felt like the kind of laughter that had been waiting all week to be used. Frankie laughed so hard he had to wipe his eyes on his sleeve, and Nora, catching sight of him, laughed even harder. Someone passed around the chocolate tin, and inside were 4 pieces of real fudge. Actual sugar, actual cocoa. No one asked where it came from, that would have spoiled the magic. They broke each piece into thirds and passed them around with reverence. Frankie got a corner with a sugar crystal still intact, and he held it in his mouth for a full minute before biting. Nora recited one of her poems, voice soft, eyes fixed on the bookshelf behind them. It was about silence and coal dust and the way light slants through broken blinds. No one interrupted. At the end, Samuel clapped twice and Ruth wiped her eyes. Harry arrived late, soaking from the rain and grumbling about lost boots and found puddles, but Ruth handed him a towel without comment and made space beside the candle. He didn't sing, he just listened, nodding from time to time, his helmet resting in his lap like a cat who'd chosen to stay. The evening stretched on like a lullaby with too many verses. Stories were told, songs hummed. Someone tapped rhythm on a tin lid with a handle of a spoon. Outside, the drizzle slowed to mist. Inside, the fire in the little cast-iron stove clicked softly, the heat moving like a quiet blessing. When it was time to leave, no one said it. They just began to shift, to fold their blankets, to refill mugs one last time. Frankie clutched Elsie's hand and yawned so wide it made Nora laugh again. Ruth kissed everyone's cheek, even the Murphy twins, who squirmed but didn't resist. Outside, the street had turned silver. The rain had left behind tiny puddles that caught the light like glass. The air smelled of soot and something sweet that might have been from the baker's chimney. Elsie and Frankie walked home slowly, Nora behind them, Harry somewhere near the shadows. In the window of the bookshop the candle still flickered. Ruth and Samuel stood together, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting on her back. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. And in the little green-shuttered house, Elsie laid Frankie to bed. His toy plane nestled beside him. She watched him for a moment, her hand resting on the quilt. Then she stepped back downstairs, relit the kettle, and poured 2 cups. The second cup steamed beside the radio, which crackled faintly with music from somewhere far away. Elsie sat, sipped, and let the warmth settle into her bones. There were no sirens that night, only the hush of a city holding its breath, and the soft sound of one woman, one cat, and one old kettle keeping each other company as the world, just for a moment, felt quiet again. The next morning woke slowly, like a child reluctant to get out of bed. Light filtered in not in beams, but in soft, lazy stretches, diffused through the thick clouds that had hung over London, like an old woolen coat for the past 3 days. The air held the damp cling of yesterday's rain, and rooftops steamed faintly as the sun, modest as it was, made a half-hearted attempt to warm them. In the little green-shuttered house on Mallow Street, Elsie stood in her kitchen, spoon poised over a chipped enamel bowl, considering the final scrapings of a tin of dried milk. There wasn't enough left to make anything properly rich, but she stirred it into the mixture anyway, as if the mere act of trying might make the milk taste fuller. On the counter, a handful of breadcrumbs, a bit of treacle syrup, and half a mashed apple waited patiently. She was making bread pudding, or something that would pass as such. Frankie had asked for it without asking, the way he'd patted his belly last night and said, "That fudge was good, but it disappeared too fast," had lingered in her head all morning. She worked quietly, her movements practised and calm, scraping the bowl with the curved edge of a spoon she'd had since the year the king took the throne. The oven ticked faintly, heat trying to stretch itself across the chilly room. A draught found its way in under the back door, curling around her ankles like an old house cat. She didn't mind. She liked feeling the house shift and breathe around her. It reminded her she wasn't alone, even in the silent hours. Frankie shuffled down the stairs, still wrapped in the palm. Quilt, his hair sticking up at odd angles, one sock already halfway off. He blinked at the smell and offered a sleepy grin. "Is it really?" he asked, sniffing dramatically. "Smells like it," Elsie replied, not turning around. "Might taste like it too, if the ration gods are smiling." He slid into the chair nearest the oven and tucked his knees up under his chin, wrapping the quilt around his shoulders like a cloak. "Can I help stir next time?" he asked, already fishing a finger toward the bowl's edge. "Not unless you want your pudding to taste like coal dust," she teased, swatting his hand gently away and placing a finger-sized piece of uncooked mixture into his waiting palm anyway. Across the street, the Kleins were unpacking a box of books that had come from a parish collection up north. Most were damaged beyond repair, pages warped with water, covers missing, spines that crumbled to the touch. But Ruth handled them as though they were family heirlooms. She sorted them into piles, one for saving, one for mending, and one for what Samuel gently referred to as peaceful burial. Each book they salvaged felt like another small victory against silence. Words still mattered, even when the world cracked at the edges. Nora stopped in later that morning with a pair of shoes tucked under one arm and a small package wrapped in oilcloth under the other. She had found the shoes discarded behind the factory, likely left by someone whose feet had outgrown them or who had upgraded to better boots through a cousin in the army. They were a little stiff, but perfectly usable. She set them by the radiator and didn't explain. Ruth simply nodded and made space on the counter. The oilcloth bundle held a wedge of something brown and slightly squashed, its shape betraying its journey. "It's not quite pudding," Nora admitted, placing it gently beside a stack of encyclopedias, "but it's close." Samuel unwrapped it slowly, as if unwrapping something sacred. He cut the wedge into 4 even pieces with a letter opener and passed them around like communion. They ate in silence, the kind that spoke more than words could have. The texture was grainy, the sweetness faint, but it was warm, and that was enough. Later, as the afternoon curled in around the street, Frankie and Elsie walked the bread pudding across the road. The tin had been wrapped in a towel for warmth, the top browned and slightly uneven but glowing with syrupy promise. Elsie had scrawled the word contribution on a bit of paper and taped it to the lid with candle wax. Frankie carried it like a bomb, arms stiff, eyes wide, every step careful and precise. The shop was already buzzing in its quiet way. Mrs. Dovey sat with her mending, humming something from her schoolgirl days. The Murphy twins were arranging dog-eared playing cards into an elaborate maze that stretched from under one bookshelf to another. Harry, perched on an upturned crate, held a cup of something, too clear to be tea, and told a story about the time he'd accidentally climbed the wrong chimney and ended up in the fireplace of a woman who'd been bathing her cat. Frankie placed the tin on the table with a dramatic flourish. "Mission complete," he declared. Samuel removed the lid, inhaled deeply, and placed one hand over his heart. "My friends," he announced, "we are rich." There was laughter, real round laughter that filled the shop like warm steam. Ruth set to cutting slices with the precision of a surgeon. The portions were small, but no one complained. It was a thing to be shared, not hoarded. Elsie took hers with a bit of evaporated milk dribbled on top. Frankie refused any topping, claiming he wanted to taste it raw. Harry asked for seconds before he'd even finished the first, and when politely declined, pretended to sulk with such theatrical misery that Ruth passed him the crumbs from the cutting board just to hush him. As twilight settled once more, a kind of peaceful hush fell over the group. No singing tonight, just the soft shuffle of pages turning, and the quiet companionship of people who had chosen to gather, again and again, even when the world outside their walls gave them every reason to curl up alone. Frankie sat cross-legged by the stove, rubbing his belly and declaring he was far too full for dinner, which Elsie translated immediately as, "He'll want bread and jam by 7. Nora, coat still damp from the walk, leaned against the bookshelf watching the flame flicker behind the stove's grate, her eyes reflecting something distant, unreadable. Samuel had brought out a chessboard with mismatched pieces and was teaching one of the twins to castle properly. No one spoke of the sirens, no one mentioned the latest casualty lists or the rumour about the factory moving south. Those things belonged to the morning. Evenings were for something else, something lighter. By the time the first distant wail of the siren reached their ears, most of the shop's warmth had worked its way into people's shoulders, their spines, the soft spots behind their knees. They moved with reluctant familiarity, packing up slowly, folding blankets, covering cups. Ruth tucked the leftover bread pudding into a wax paper parcel and handed it to Elsie with a look that said more than thank you ever could. Back in her kitchen, the kettle waited. Frankie shed his shoes at the door and immediately began laying out the bedding near the stove, announcing that the floorboards by the window were squeaky and thus excellent for detecting intruders. Elsie filled the kettle, lit the stove, and watched the flame catch. The night outside felt sharper, the wind rising a little more than before, but inside it was quiet, and full, and good. She poured 2 cups, one for herself, one for the man who no longer sat across from her. She let the steam warm her hands and watched Frankie begin to nod off, his toy plane resting under one arm, his cheek pressed against the sleeve of her old cardigan. Sometimes joy came in a tin lined with towel scraps, sometimes it tasted like apples and syrup and burnt crust, and sometimes it came quietly, in the form of a boy dreaming on your rug and the sound of water just about to boil. The sirens were not as loud as they used to be, or maybe the people had simply learned how to live around them. When the wail split the evening, his voice curling across the rooftops like a question that had long since stopped needing an answer, no one panicked, no one rushed. There was an unspoken choreography now, a way of folding themselves around danger without letting it tear through the quiet rituals they'd built. On Mallow Street, doors creaked open, not in fear but in familiar rhythm, like neighbours stepping onto a shared stage they all knew by heart. Elsie stirred the kettle again and glanced toward the window. She couldn't see much beyond the curtain, but she heard the soft shuffle of feet outside, the careful movements of people slipping into coats, collecting blankets, and remembering the things they would miss most if the worst ever came to pass. She waited a moment longer, not because she wasn't ready, but because she liked to give Frankie time to wake himself gently. He'd fallen asleep in his nest of cushions not long after pudding, one sock off, one hand curled around the nose of his toy plane as though steering it through dreams. She bent down now and touched his shoulder lightly. He stirred with a small grunt, rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, and nodded before she even said a word. He was already halfway into his coat before he fully opened his eyes, the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before, and yet still blinked wide with wonder at the world each time it changed colour. By the time they reached the street, it had begun to drizzle, a thin mist that kissed their faces and caught in their hair, softening the edges of chimneys and blurring the sharp corners of buildings. The bookshop door was already closed, its curtains drawn, but a narrow sliver of light still pulsed from beneath the frame. Elsie knew Ruth would stay up for a while, not reading or cleaning, but simply sitting in the front room with her feet on a footstool and her head tilted slightly to one side, listening to the world outside as if waiting for it to ask her a question. The shelter down near the rail line had become a second living room to them all. It smelled faintly of stone and paraffin, of wool blankets and biscuits stored too long in tin. Someone had tried to brighten the place with drawings, pencil sketches taped to the walls, mostly of cats and birds and lopsided rainbows. One of the Murphy twins had drawn a dinosaur in the corner, complete with a speech bubble that read, "No bombs allowed." No one took it down. Inside, people settled in slowly. Harry was already there, balancing a mug on one knee and holding court with a small group of children who clung to every word of his increasingly outlandish tale about a pigeon who'd once carried a love letter from Paris to Peckham. His voice was low, scratchy at the edges, but steady. Nora sat against the far wall, legs stretched out in front of her, coat still buttoned. She wasn't speaking tonight, just watching, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the hem of her scarf. Elsie and Frankie found a familiar spot near the stove and laid out their small blanket. She poured water from a thermos into a chipped cup and handed it to him. He took it with both hands, careful not to spill, and blew on it solemnly before sipping. The sirens faded eventually, replaced by the dull thrum of distant engines and, later, the hush of uneasy silence. A few people dozed, others whispered. One or two snored, gently and without shame. The rain had deepened outside, now falling with the steady confidence of a story that knew its ending. At some point during the night, when even the walls seemed to be breathing slower, Frankie tugged lightly on Elsie's sleeve and whispered, "Can I tell you something?" She leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from his cheek. "Always." He looked around as if to check that the shelter walls wouldn't repeat him, then whispered, "I think the plane talks to me sometimes." Elsie didn't laugh, she just nodded, warm and sure. "What does it say?" "Says to keep going," he replied, "even if we're scared." She looked down at him, at his face so open and serious in the dim light, and felt a weight and a warmth in her chest that didn't come from the stove. "You're a brave pilot," she said, and meant it more than he would ever know. They returned home just before dawn. The street was damp and glistening, the sky still dark but losing its grip. Elsie hung their coats near the door and set about boiling water. She didn't even bother pretending she'd go back to sleep. Frankie curled up again in the blankets and was out before the kettle whistled. The house was quiet, a stillness filled with more than absence. It was full of breath, memory, the ticking of a clock, and the softness of a world rebuilding itself, piece by quiet piece. Later that day, after toast and jam and another trip to the grocer, Elsie wandered into the bookshop with a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. Ruth looked up from her mending with a question in her eyes, but Elsie simply handed over the bundle and said, "For the front window." Inside were 3 small paper cutouts, a cat, a plane, and a girl with a book, each one carefully clipped from the newspaper adverts she'd been saving. Ruth unwrapped them slowly and pressed a hand to her chest. "They'll catch the light just right," she said softly. She placed them in the window between 2 volumes of poetry and a faded copy of Wuthering Heights. The cat faced outward, the plane tilted upward, and the girl seemed to be gazing at the sky. Outside, children stopped to look at them on the way home from school. One boy left a marble on the windowsill. The little girl pointed and said, "She's reading about stars." Ruth kept the window just so, uncurtained for the first time in weeks. That evening the group didn't gather. There was no formal invitation, no drawn-out plans, but the bookshop's front room slowly filled with the sound of footsteps, and soon cushions were being pulled from under chairs, mugs filled with steaming water, and pages turned softly in hands that had held too much fear. Harry brought a harmonica and played something that sounded a little like "We'll Meet Again," and a little like something entirely his own. Nora brought a piece of chalk and drew a sun on the corner of the fireplace. Frankie showed everyone the newest detail he'd added to his spy plane, a ribbon from Elsie's old curtain, now tied like a banner to the tail. Samuel read a story aloud, but stopped halfway through because Ruth had started laughing too hard at the voice he used for the villain, and then everyone was laughing and the story didn't matter nearly as much as the sound of them all, breathing and chuckling together, filling the shop with something stronger than walls or sirens or stone. And later, when the group had left and the street was dark again, the paper girl still sat in the window, her paper eyes fixed on the sky, where stars now blinked shyly between the clouds. Morning had come again, though it never announced itself loudly. It crept in gently through the cracks in the curtains and settled across the rooftops like a shawl laid carefully over the city. On Mallow Street, the light moved slowly, hesitating at windows, skimming over soot-dark bricks, and peeking shyly beneath the eaves where pigeons huddled, like old men sharing secrets. There was a stillness to the air, not from peace exactly, but from fatigue, a kind of shared communal breath taken after a long-held pause. Elsie Turner stood at her front step with a dish towel in her hand and yesterday's ash under her fingernails. She had cleaned the stove before tea and scrubbed the kettle's bottom until it no longer left black rings on the burner. She was proud of that. Small triumphs mattered, especially when larger ones refused to arrive. She stretched her back slowly and watched the street blink itself awake. Down the row, someone had put out a potted plant, its single red bloom quivering in the chill like a tiny flag of stubborn hope. Frankie was inside, finishing a drawing of a dog that looked suspiciously like a pig with long legs. He'd found a stub of red pencil behind the dresser and insisted it was lucky. Now, every creature he drew had red ears. Elsie had said nothing, but she saved the pictures anyway, slipping them into the drawer beneath the cutlery where only the important things were kept. The knock at the door came softly, the sort of knock that expected to be ignored. Elsie wiped her hands and opened it. Without hurry. On the step stood a boy of about 16, tall in the way boys become tall too fast, with shoulders that hadn't yet learned how to carry weight. His coat was thin, the sleeves too short, and his shoes had the look of leather that had once been good but now bent in ways that told the truth. He held a small parcel wrapped in wax paper and string, and his expression was careful, like someone trying not to drop a full cup. He cleared his throat. "Parcel for Miss Turner," he said, though it came out more like a question than a statement. Elsie frowned gently. "That's me, though not many still use the miss." The boy offered a lopsided smile and handed over the bundle. "Came with the early post, left with the baker by mistake, I think. Name's Hartley, from the sorting shed up Wren Road." She took the parcel and turned it over in her hands. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It belonged to Nora. "Would you like a bit of toast, Mr. Hartley?" she asked, already stepping back into the house without waiting for his answer. He hesitated, blinked, and then followed, wiping his boots on the mat as if stepping into a chapel. The house smelled of soap and old books and the faint sweetness of sugar that had been cooked too long. Frankie looked up from his drawing and nodded at the newcomer without suspicion. Elsie poured 2 mugs of hot water, dropped a shaving of lemon rind into each, and passed one to the boy. He sat carefully on the edge of the chair, balancing his mug like it might shatter if handled too boldly. "It's quiet here," he said after a minute. Elsie nodded, unwrapping the parcel on the counter. "We save our noise for the important things." Inside the wax paper was a folded cloth napkin, and within it a short stack of typed pages held together with a rusty paperclip. At the top, in careful neat letters, was the title, "Notes on Air That Sings, Observations from the Shelter Wall." Elsie raised her eyebrows, glanced at Frankie, who had abandoned his drawing to peer over her arm, and then smiled to herself. Nora's poetry. Later that morning, after Hartley had thanked her twice and shuffled off into the street with half a sandwich in his pocket, Elsie walked across to the bookshop. She found Ruth arranging a stack of second-hand maps near the window. Maps so faded the rivers looked more like veins, and the towns like faint freckles on skin. Samuel was thumbing through a dictionary that had lost its cover and most of its S pages. "I've brought treasure," Elsie announced, holding the papers high. Ruth stopped, turned, and reached for them with a kind of quiet reverence. She read the title and let out a soft breath. "She writes like someone who never expects to be read," she said, "which is what makes her worth reading." They placed the pages in the window beside the paper girl and the marble. A small sign was added below in Samuel's careful script. "Take 1 page. Leave a word." By mid-afternoon, 2 pages had been taken and a strip of paper had been tucked under the frame bearing the word "longing" written in pencil. Across the street, Frankie stood at the window watching the traffic of passers-by. He held his drawing of the red-eared dog in one hand and tapped the glass gently with the other. "Do you think she'll write about us?" he asked. Elsie, who was sorting through a tin of old stamps in the front room, looked up. "Nora?" He nodded. "In the poems." She tilted her head thoughtfully. If she does, I hope she remembers your red pencil. That afternoon, clouds gathered with more certainty, pressing low over the rooftops. A wind picked up from the east, sharp and damp, carrying the scent of wet stone and old coal. By 4, the first drops of the rain began to spatter against the windows. People retreated inside, pulling curtains, stoking fires. Harry passed the window wearing his oilskin and shouting something about "a bloody proper drizzle, finally," before disappearing down the alley with a handful of kindling tucked under one arm. In the shop, a young woman no one knew by name came in, soaked to the bone and clutching a broken umbrella. Ruth offered her a towel, Samuel a seat, and Elsie, who had wandered over again, produced a square of dried apple from her pocket. No one asked her where she'd come from. She didn't offer. Instead, she picked up one of Nora's pages from the window, read it quietly and said, "This one's about me." They all nodded, because somehow it was. Night fell slowly, as it often did when the world was damp and thoughtful. The sirens remained silent. In Elsie's kitchen, the kettle steamed. In the shop, the candles burned down to their stubs, and on the window beside the paper girl, the plate and the marble, more words began to appear, words left on napkins, scrap paper, the back of receipts, words like hearth, hush, and hope. And in Nora's coat pocket, miles away at the factory, another poem took shape, waiting patiently for a day when someone might need it more than she did. The following morning came in like a sigh, a heavy, damp breath of sky and earth that lingered over rooftops and sagging chimneys, making everything appear slightly smudged. It was one of those days where the air didn't seem to move much, where sounds felt padded and thoughts came slower, like boots on soaked carpet. On Mallow Street, puddles from last night's rain clung to the edges of the pavement like reluctant memories, their surfaces still and dark, reflecting crooked door frames and curtains drawn half-closed. Inside the bookshop, the Kleins had started the day earlier than usual. Ruth sat at the table beneath the front window, sleeves rolled up, sorting through a stack of book donations someone had left under the awning during the rain. Each cover was carefully dried with an old hand towel, and each page was checked for mould or the signs of a long-forgotten biscuit crumb. Samuel moved about behind her, humming something tuneless under his breath as he tried to fix a jammed drawer in the corner cabinet that had refused to close since 1938. The scent of strong tea mixed with the musty smell of pages and old ink, filling the shop with something warm and permanent. They worked in companionable quiet, interrupted only by the bell over the door jingling, as Frankie burst in, soaked to the knees, and holding what looked like a roll of wallpaper under one arm. "I found this behind the greengrocer's bin," he announced, dropping the bundle onto the floor with dramatic flair. "No idea what it is, but think it might be maps." Ruth lifted one corner and raised an eyebrow. "Or curtains," she murmured, but already she was smoothing out the paper across the puddle, revealing faded lines, curling edges, and what did appear to be a street plan of some sort. Samuel adjusted his glasses and leaned in. "It's an old fire route diagram," he said after a moment. "Here, see that? That's the old timber yard, burned down in the last war. These were probably used by the wardens." Frankie beamed. "So it's important then?" "Very," Samuel agreed, and meant it, because everything was important in a time when forgetting was too easy. Ruth fetched her small tin of ink and a rubber stamp. It wasn't official, but she liked to mark new arrivals with the shop's name, as if claiming them as kin. She let Frankie press the stamp this time, guiding his thumb over the ink pad and helping him place it carefully into the corner of the map. The print smudged slightly, leaving a faint trail of ink across his hand. He examined it like it was a wound. "Looks like a badge," Johnny said, holding his thumb up proudly. Just then the door creaked open again, and Nora stepped inside, shaking droplets from her sleeves. Her coat was slick with rain and her eyes looked tired, but her mouth curved into a half smile when she saw the group gathered around the table. "Morning," she offered, unbuttoning slowly. "Smells like paper and pride in here." "Compliments of our young explorer," Ruth said, nodding at her Frankie, who still held his thumb in the air like a knight displaying a fresh medal. Nora hung her coat on the hook behind the counter and stepped forward to examine the map. Her fingers traced the fire lines with surprising delicacy, pausing briefly at the name of a street she didn't recognise. "Was this from the Blitz?" she asked softly. Samuel nodded. "Judging by the ink, those markings were standard issue back then." Nora didn't say anything, but her hand lingered on the paper a moment longer. Then she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been writing again," she said, eyes on the page. "Do you want to hear it?" There was no fanfare, no clapping or dramatics. Ruth simply pulled a chair closer. Samuel found his pipe and lit it quietly, and Frankie folded himself onto the rug, chin in hands. Nora opened the notebook and began to read, her voice low but certain. The poem was about waiting. About people who sit at windows with their hands around empty cups, who count footsteps on the pavement and wonder if the ones they love are walking those paths too. It was about coats that still hang on pegs long after they've stopped being worn, and about the way light filters through lace curtains at noon, turning everything briefly golden. When she finished, no one spoke for a while. The only sound was the soft creak of Samuel's chair as he leaned back. "That one," Ruth said eventually, "should go in the window." Nora hesitated, then tore the page from her notebook and handed it over. Frankie stood up and pointed at the little table by the door. "It can go next to the plane." Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper. The puddles were starting to lose their reflections as the sky brightened slightly. A hint of sunlight trying its best to push through the stubborn grey. Later that day, Harry arrived with a parcel under his arm, and his face set in the determined scowl he always wore when trying not to seem hopeful. He didn't explain where the parcel came from, only said it was addressed to those people in the shop who keep the words warm. Ruth opened it to find a bundle of blank note cards, each one thick and cream-coloured, with just enough texture to hold ink beautifully. No return address, just a small note inside that read, "Write something worth reading." They added the cards to the window display. People began stopping more often, pressing their faces to the glass, reading the scraps of poetry, the single words left behind by strangers. One boy wrote "Courage" on a sweet wrapper and taped it to the frame. A woman came every day just to read in silence, her lips moving as if praying. Elsie brought over a stack of her old recipe cards, now nearly blank but still bearing the faint shadow of treacle or ginger. She said they made perfect backing for poetry. Nora didn't say much that day, only nodded and returned later with 3 new pages, each one folded carefully like a letter. By the week's end, the window had become a mosaic of human effort. Dog-eared corners and careful loops of handwriting, smudged ink and words that looked like they'd been written in a hurry. Children began leaving drawings. A chalkboard was placed just outside with a message, "What made you smile today?" People answered in every sort of way. A warm sock, a clean sheet, a song on the radio, and amidst it all, the paper girl sat quietly with her book still facing the sky. That evening, with the candles lit low and the wind moving gently through the chimney, Elsie sat with Frankie at the small table, helping him spell out a poem of his own. He dictated slowly, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth as she scribbled in her best penmanship. "My plane went far but came back near. It saw the sky and landed here. It told me dreams are made from glue and tape and string and wishes too." When they finished, Frankie signed his name at the bottom, slowly and with great seriousness. Then he yawned so wide his jaw popped and declared himself creatively exhausted. Elsie laughed softly and folded the page in half. "We'll bring it in the morning," she said. "It deserves a place on the window." Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The sky held a little more blue than before, and inside the green-shuttered house the kettle began to sing the way it always did, just before the night turned soft and the world, for a while, remembered how to rest. The next morning stretched slowly across the rooftops like warm butter on cold bread, soft and uneven but full of promise. Mallow Street had the peculiar hush that followed a night of uninterrupted sleep. No sirens, no distant rumble of engines, no flurry of hurried boots past dark windows. Just the slow waking of kettles being filled, curtains nudged open with cautious fingers, and the quiet creak of floorboards beneath socked feet. It was the kind of morning that felt older than the war itself, as if it belonged to a quieter century and had somehow wandered in by mistake. Elsie stood in her kitchen, holding Frankie's freshly folded poem in one hand and a steaming mug of barley tea in the other. The window beside the stove had fogged up from the warmth inside, and she drew a slow spiral on the glass with her knuckle, just for the pleasure of watching it appear. The house smelled like toast again, though none had been made yet. Perhaps the memory of yesterday's breakfast was clinging to the air, or maybe it was just the smell of comfort taking up residence in the old walls. Frankie shuffled in, hair still wild, holding to his toy plane loosely at his side like a well-worn talisman. He didn't speak at first, just walked to the table, climbed onto the bench seat, and placed the plane gently beside the folded poem. Then, resting his elbows on the wood, he sighed. A long, deliberate sigh. The kind that children use when they're waiting for someone to ask what's wrong. Elsie raised an eyebrow as she sat opposite him. Something bothering you, Commander? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out and rotated the plane slightly so it faced the window, then looked up. I don't want anyone to laugh at it, he said finally. Elsie smiled, not with amusement but with that quiet kind of understanding only grandmothers and old friends seem to possess. If they do, it'll only be because they see something real in it, and real things make people nervous sometimes. Frankie mulled that over. But what if they don't get it? Then it's not for them, she replied simply, taking a sip of tea. Not every story is everyone's story, but if you wrote it with your heart, someone will see theirs in it too. They walked to the shop just after 9. The morning air still held a damp chill, but sunlight pushed through the mist in delicate and golden shafts that seemed to spotlight patches of pavement as though nature itself were pointing out all the best bits. Frankie carried the poem in his inside coat pocket, folded neatly and protected from the breeze, while Elsie carried a tin with 3 scones and a small square of jam wrapped in wax paper. She'd made them with powdered egg and more hope than flour. The shop was already open. Ruth had propped the door to let in the scent of morning, and Samuel was kneeling on the floor with a spool of twine and an armful of pages, trying to string them together into a makeshift curtain of words to hang across the back shelves. The window display had grown overnight. Someone had left a posy of dried flowers between the marble and the plane. Another had drawn a picture of a lion reading a book, now taped beside the chalkboard, which asked today, "What did you see in your dream?" Frankie hovered near the display for a moment, clutching the poem tightly, before walking to the table and setting it down in front of Ruth. She read it in silence, tracing each line with her finger, her expression softening as she reached the last stanza. "It's perfect," she said. "Would you like to put it up?" Frankie nodded, and she handed him a tiny wooden clip and stepped back. He chose a spot just above the paper girl's head, where the light from the window caught the top edge of the poem and made it glow slightly. As he clipped it into place, his fingers trembled just a little, but he didn't let go until it was steady. Then he stepped back, looked at it, and smiled. Samuel offered him a thumbs up from the floor without looking up. "Another fine addition to the collection," he said. The shop filled slowly that day. A boy with a missing front tooth came in and recited a limerick he'd made up on the walk from school. A postman left a haiku about the sound of boots on cobblestone. An old woman with clouded eyes asked Ruth to read the window poems aloud, while she sat with her hands in her lap, nodding gently at the rhythm of each line. Every visitor left something, a word, a thought, a small piece of themselves in ink or crayon or breath. In the early afternoon, Nora came in with coal dust still clinging to her sleeves and oil under her fingernails. She hadn't had time to change, but said she needed to see the new pieces. She scanned the display slowly, reading each contribution, until she came to Frankie's. She read it twice, then knelt beside him where he sat with his knees pulled to his chest and said very softly, "You made something beautiful." He looked down, cheeks colouring. and shrugged in that way children do when they don't know how to accept a compliment without cracking a joke. But Nora didn't laugh. She simply tapped the poem with her finger and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, after supper and baths and the steady drone of them, the wireless humming through the house like a lullaby, Elsie sat by the window with her knitting, letting the rhythm of her needles match the tick of the mantel clock. Frankie was curled on the rug beside her, book open on his chest, though his eyes were closed. The kettle murmured softly on the stove, and the scent of mint from a handful of crushed leaves she'd added filled the room with quiet coolness. Outside, the street had grown dark again, though a few windows still glowed with lamplight. The drizzle had returned, more mist than rain, wrapping the houses in silver and softening the lines of everything. Somewhere far off, a piano was being played. Just a simple tune, drifting through the still air like something from a time before. Elsie looked out at the window across the street, where the paper poems flickered in the gaslight, the marble still nestled safely in place. The girl with the book stared upward, and beside her, Frankie's poem fluttered just slightly, the breeze catching the edges like a breath. And in that moment, the war felt very far away. The next evening began differently. The wind that had slipped softly through Mallow Street the night before had changed its mind, arriving now with more intention, rustling the eaves and stirring up corners of the street where leaves had long since settled into comfortable forgetfulness. It was not a cruel wind, not yet, but it had urgency. People noticed it in the way their coats tugged tighter across their backs, and in how the front doors closed just a little faster behind them. It wasn't cold so much as expectant, the kind of weather that made you pause with your hand on the windowsill and listen just a moment longer than necessary. Elsie felt it too. She stood by the sink, sleeves rolled high, forearms splashed with soapy water, and stared out the small square window above the basin. The glass was streaked from the earlier drizzle, and the yard beyond looked muddy and slow. Her hands paused in the washpan as she tilted her head, half listening. Not to the radio or the clinking dishes, but to that silent signal the air sometimes gave off when something somewhere was about to change. She had felt it the morning James left, and again the night the sirens didn't stop for nearly an hour. This evening had that same quiet pull, a thread gently tugging in her chest. Still, the house remained warm. Frankie was at the kitchen table again, back bent in deep concentration over a small box of the matchsticks and glue. He was attempting to build what he called a bomb-proof tea trolley, a contraption with wheels made from buttons and a cardboard tray to carry a pair of cups. The design made little sense, but the effort was sincere, and Elsie didn't dare interrupt him. Not when he was so focused, tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth, eyes narrowed with the seriousness of an architect designing cathedrals. Behind him, the fire at the stove snapped softly. The room smelled faintly of boiled carrots and dust, with just a ghost of the lavender sachet Elsie kept in the drawer near the stove, more a memory than a scent now. The clock ticked in its calm, practised way, as if reminding the house that time was still unfolding gently and without demand. Then the lights flickered, not just once, but in a series of quick, indecisive blinks, like a person trying to remember a forgotten word. Frankie looked up, eyebrows raised. Elsie dried her hands on the cloth tucked at her waist and moved to the cupboard under the stairs where the candles lived, nestled beside tins of beans and the good pair of scissors. By the time she returned, the lights had gone out entirely, not abruptly, more like someone had turned down the world's volume one notch too far. Outside, the street lamp across from the shop glowed once and then dimmed, and a hush rolled down the street, gentle but complete. "Blackout?" Frankie asked, though it didn't sound like a question. "Likely the grid," Elsie replied, striking a match and lighting the first candle. "Or someone somewhere needed more light than we did." The candle caught with a soft flare and settled into a steady glow. She placed it in the middle of the table, where it threw wide golden halos across Frankie's project and turned his glue bottle into a shining monument. She lit 2 more and arranged them on the windowsill, then 1 more for the stove, purely for comfort. The house changed shape in the candlelight. Shadows lengthened and corners retreated. The air grew quieter, even though nothing had stopped. Frankie gathered his project into a pile and moved to sit closer to the window, watching the flicker of flame in the glass. "It makes everything look older," he said after a while. Elsie, who had just set the kettle to warm again, turned and smiled. "Maybe it's just showing us how things really are." Across the street, the bookshop flickered into view, not through its lights, but through silhouettes. Shapes moved behind the curtains, blurred by the thickness of the old panes. The window display shimmered softly in the glow from a candle someone had placed just inside the glass. The marble reflected it faintly, and the paper girl's face seemed, for the briefest moment, to be turning toward it. "I wonder if they're reading," Frankie said. "They're always reading," Elsie replied. They sat like that for some time. No rush, no radio, just the hum of the kettle, the slow waxy drip of candles, and the occasional murmur of wind testing the window frames. Elsie eventually poured them each a mug of barley water, adding a sliver of lemon peel to hers and a pinch of sugar to Frankie's. He sipped slowly, staring into the flame like he expected it to tell him something. Then the door creaked. Not in surprise, but in that familiar way old doors do when the air pressure shifts or a latch catches just so. It was Ruth. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, stepping inside, with her hands wrapped around a small bundle of folded cloth. "The lights went out across the whole block. Samuel stayed behind to mind the shop. I thought you might have a few candles to spare." Elsie waved her in and gestured to the table. "Sit. Warm your hands. We've enough flame for a dinner party." Ruth laughed softly and peeled off her gloves, settling into the chair opposite Frankie, who now cradled his drink like a delicate secret. She opened the cloth to reveal 3 tiny biscuits, no bigger than buttons, and laid them on the plate between them. "Samuel baked them yesterday while I was inventorying. Swears it was to use up the flour, but I think he just missed the smell of something sweet." Elsie fetched a second plate and divided the biscuits without hesitation. "They smell like cinnamon." "Which they aren't," Ruth said with a grin. "But if you say it aloud, you almost taste it." They ate in silence, not out of awkwardness, but respect. Each crumb was savoured, each sip followed by a slow breath. And in the low light, the little house felt like the centre of something larger than itself. Not a street, not a city, but a moment. A tiny, perfect moment caught between everything else. Later, when the candles had burned down halfway and the shadows had grown friendly, Elsie brought out her sewing tin and began to mend the frayed cuff on Frankie's coat. Ruth watched, hands folded in her lap, occasionally offering a pin or holding the sleeve steady. Outside, the wind had eased. A few more windows had candles glowing in them now, and the street, far from being dark, felt gently lit from within. Light came not from above, but from the hearths and tables of people choosing to soften the night, one flame at a time. When Ruth finally rose to leave, she took with her a spare candle, a wedge of paper for poetry, and the promise of tomorrow's tea. Frankie had fallen asleep beside the stove, cheeks flushed from warmth and sugar, his plane tucked beneath one arm. Elsie carried him to the bed without waking him, tucking the blanket up to his chin and brushing a stray hair from his forehead. Then she returned to the kitchen, poured the last of the hot water into her cup, and sat by the window to watch the night flicker. The paper girl still stared upward, and tonight, in the dance of candlelight, she seemed almost to smile. The next day unfurled with a kind of easy slowness, the kind of rhythm that made people whisper without meaning to and walk softer, even though no one asked them to. There was a tenderness to it. The sky was pale and even, like it had been rubbed down to its softest colour, a shy sort of grey that held no threat but no promise either. It simply was, and that was enough. Elsie opened the back door with her elbow, arms full of damp laundry, and stepped out into the yard where the old washing line sagged slightly between 2 posts. The ground was still spongy from the week's drizzle, and she carefully avoided the patch that always turned to mud just under the rosebush. The air smelled faintly of soap and smoke and whatever it is that lives in London's bricks, the scent of old things holding on. She pinned up a flannel first, then one of Frankie's shirts, small and missing a button, then a slip that had long since lost its shape but was still good for sleeping in. The wind played lightly with the hems, tugging at them with the gentlest mischief, making them flutter like flags strung across a forgotten border. As she worked, her thoughts drifted. Not far, just enough to skim the surface of memory, like a flat stone skipping across water. She thought of James, not in the way that made her chest tighten, but in the quieter way, like remembering the feel of a coat he used to wear, or the exact sound his boots made on the steps after a late shift. She thought of the bookshop window too, and how the poems had started to layer so thickly now that some overlapped, and every time she passed by, a new one would catch her eye. People had begun leaving their names at the bottom. Not full names, just initials, or sometimes a drawing. One was signed with the outline of a fox, another with 3 stars and a crescent moon. Frankie had left another that morning, a short poem about breakfast. It had taken him 5 minutes to write and 15 to decide on the best way to fold it. He'd slipped it into the window box beside the paper plane, and Ruth had added it to the display with a smile. Elsie had watched from across the road, heart quietly full. Back inside, the house felt still in the way only old houses can, where silence is never truly silent but filled with the tick of the clock and the soft breathing of rooms. She made tea, strong and plain, and carried it to the front room where she sat down with her knitting. The needles moved with practiced ease, the wool sliding over her fingers like something tame and familiar. She had nearly finished a scarf meant for Nora, a deep plum colour made from a leftover spool she'd found in a drawer she hadn't opened in months. It was a small thing, but small things, she had learned, could stretch further than anyone expected. By late morning, the street had begun to stir. The butcher's boy whistled as he passed, even though he carried nothing to sell. 2 girls walked arm in arm toward the grocer, arguing in hushed tones about the right way to slice an apple. Across the road, Samuel emerged with a stepladder and a roll of twine, intent on reinforcing the sign above the shop, which had begun to tilt slightly to the left. Ruth stood just inside the doorway, reading aloud from a letter they'd received, something from a cousin in Devon who claimed to have seen a fox carrying a loaf of bread. Frankie sat on the steps nearby, working on a new invention that involved a tin can, 3 corks, and what might have once been part of a bicycle bell. The mood held steady all through midday. People moved with ease, unhurried and unbothered, and the wind, though persistent, never quite crossed into being rude. Even Nora, who arrived later than usual and with circles under her eyes, seemed to carry herself with a softer weight. She joined Elsie for a cup of tea around the back, sinking into the chair beside the rain barrel, with a sigh so deep it seemed to draw the tension from her very bones. "Long shift?" Elsie asked, handing over the enamel mug. "Like 2 glued together," Nora replied, sipping carefully. "One of the machines jammed and they had us on rotation half the night, but they played music for us while we waited. Some American tune, can't remember the name, had a trumpet in it, all shiny and loud. Felt like dancing, but my legs disagreed." They sat for a while without speaking, just watching the laundry flutter and listening to the sound of water dripping steadily from the edge of the gutter into the weeds below. A pigeon landed on the wall, cooed once, then flew off again, as if checking in and finding nothing worth staying for. Eventually Nora leaned back and stretched, her boots scraping against the stone. "Do you think this will all be remembered?" she asked suddenly. Elsie looked at her. "You mean the war?" "No," Nora said, shaking her head. "This. The little parts. The poems in windows. The way the light hits your teacup just right. Frankie's inventions. These mornings." Elsie considered the question. "I think the big things are always remembered first," she said slowly. "But it's the little ones that matter most in the end. They find their way into stories without names, and maybe that's how they last." Later that evening, the children gathered at the bookshop again. Not officially. There had been no invitation, but somehow they knew, just as the grown-ups did, that the day deserved to be ended together. Ruth had baked something that looked like a cake, but was in truth more bread than sweet. She cut it into thin slices and served it with apple jam. Harry arrived with his harmonica and played a tune no one recognised but that everyone liked. Nora read a poem that was only half finished, stopping at the last line and saying, "That's where you come in," which made everyone laugh. Frankie stood up and explained his latest invention in great detail, most of which involved imaginary physics. He concluded with a solemn promise that the bomb-proof tea trolley would be ready for public demonstration by next Tuesday. The room applauded warmly. As the candles burned lower and the shadows grew friendlier, Elsie passed around her scarf to show the progress. Nora touched the stitches with quiet reverence. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's warm," Elsie replied, "and that's more important." Outside, the wind had gone to bed. The streetlights glowed gently, and the poems in the window shifted slightly, their edges curling just enough to catch the candlelight. The paper girl still stared upward, unblinking, and beside her the poem about breakfast danced gently in the glass. And as the night deepened, as the fire dimmed, and laughter gave way to soft goodbyes and slow steps home, Mallow Street held itself still and full, like a teacup filled to the very edge. The wind stayed gone for a while. For 3 days, maybe 4, it felt like the air had chosen stillness as its gift. Mallow Street settled into the sort of lull that didn't come often during those years. It wasn't exactly quiet, not in the way countryside places are, but it was a kind of peace made up of ordinary sounds that meant life continued as it should. The kettle boiled, children squabbled gently over chalk colours. A window shutter thumped softly where a hinge had given up the fight. And through it all, the constant, unhurried hum of people finding ways to be people again. Elsie used the calm to finally scrub the scullery floor, a task she'd avoided for weeks, not out of laziness, but because the act itself felt like a promise she hadn't been ready to make. Cleaning floors during wartime could feel either very brave or very foolish depending on the day. Today it felt brave. The tiles were old and uneven, stained from decades of boots and tea spills and one unfortunate moment involving mustard in a broken jar. But when she leaned back on her heels and looked at them drying in the sunlight that streamed through the door, she felt something in her chest loosen. Not everything could be made new, but some things at least could be made clean. Frankie had turned his attention to a new project, having quietly retired the tea trolley after a failed test run involving a slope, a cat, and 2 unfortunate mugs. Now he was building something he called a letter launcher, a contraption that would, in theory, deliver folded notes from his bedroom window to the front step of the bookshop. It was mostly string and hope, but Elsie admired the ambition. He worked on it with the same grave determination he brought to all his inventions, pausing only to snack on apple slices, or wander into the garden to check on a worm he'd adopted. Nora came by that afternoon, carrying a basket with a torn handle and a look that suggested she hadn't slept properly in days. She sank into the kitchen chair like someone slipping into a familiar coat, dropping the basket to the floor with a thud. Inside it were 2 tins of powdered milk, a crumpled packet of tea, and half a loaf of something dense enough to qualify as building material. She didn't explain where she'd gotten them, and Elsie didn't ask. There were some stories that weren't meant to be shared all at once. They brewed tea anyway, strong and bitter, and Nora added an extra spoonful of sugar from her pocket ration. They drank without speaking, letting the quiet fill the room the way it sometimes did between people who had grown comfortable in one another's stillness. Outside, Frankie's strings danced across the alley, weaving between windows like spider silk. One snapped, sending a paper glider tumbling onto the roof below. He shrugged, made a note, and tied another. Eventually Nora reached into her coat and pulled out a page. Not the usual kind torn from a notebook, but heavier, folded in quarters, with a crease so sharp it looked ironed. She unfolded it and laid it on the table between them. A poem, or maybe a letter. The words were arranged like bricks, each one resting on the one beneath it. No rhyme this time, just a slow, gentle rhythm. It was about fire, not the kind that burned buildings or turned skies orange, but the fire that sat in a hearth and kept people from growing too cold. It was about the fire in someone's voice when they said your name kindly. The fire in the hands that reached out to help without needing thanks. The fire you couldn't see but always knew was there, like the warmth of tea in a chipped cup or the glow of a candle on a windowsill. It was titled A Fire Without Smoke. Elsie read it twice, then a third time. She didn't speak for a while after that. When she did, her voice was soft. It should go in the window. Nora shook her head. Not yet. I want to hear someone else read it first, just to make sure it sounds like I meant it to. So Elsie read it aloud, slow and steady, her voice catching slightly near the end. When she finished, they didn't speak again for some time. The clock ticked on. Frankie's paper gliders floated past the window like silent messengers, and in the room the air felt warmer, though the stove had long since gone cold. That evening Ruth invited everyone to the shop. She'd found an old oil lamp in the back room and wanted to see if it still worked. The news had travelled the street by supper time, and by 7 the shop was gently full, not crowded, just filled enough to make the floorboards creak and the windows fog. Samuel lit the lamp carefully, trimming the wick with his pocket knife, and when it flared to life the room gave a quiet collective sigh. Its glow was deeper than the candles, more golden, and it settled into the corners like it had always belonged there. Ruth brewed a pot of tea on a little spirit burner and passed around chipped cups and broken biscuits. Nora's poem sat on the table in a neat stack of copies, and people took turns reading it aloud. Each voice changed it slightly, giving it new rhythms, new colours, but the warmth stayed the same. Frankie, too shy to read aloud, folded one of the pages into a paper boat and set it floating gently in the tin basin Ruth used to rinse the mop. It bobbed silently under the glow of the oil lamp, carrying the poem like cargo. No one stopped him. Harry arrived late, carrying a jar of pickled onions and a harmonica in his coat pocket. He declared the shop the safest place in London and took up his usual spot by the window, where he hummed along to whatever was being read, not always in tune, but never unpleasantly. Outside, the street lay in soft darkness. The blackout curtains held firm, but the oil lamp made the shop glow faintly at the edges, like a lighthouse half remembered. The wind had returned, but gently now, just enough to stir the corners of paper and whisper through keyholes. Later, when the poems had all been read and the tea had run out, Elsie walked home with Frankie half asleep against her side. His hands were ink-smudged and his pockets full of folded paper and string. At their front step she paused and looked back. The shop window was still, the paper girl watching the sky, and in her lap, a paper boat now rested beside the plane and the marble. On the glass, someone had drawn a flame with their finger, just a smudge really, but enough to catch the light. And inside the quiet house, the fire without smoke glowed on. Morning came shyly the next day, as if hesitant to disturb the hush that lingered after the oil lamp's glow had dimmed. The sky was a pale smudge, neither bright nor dull, and a faint dew had crept along the pavement, leaving the stone a shade darker than usual. Mallow Street woke in pieces with slow footsteps and the soft creak of stairboards. Windows opened in quiet greeting, just a few inches at first, as if testing the air for any news, and through the thin light and low sky the usual rhythm resumed. A pot clanged softly. A baby cried, then settled. The radio in number 12 crackled to life, offering nothing but a long sigh of static before the newsreader's voice settled into place. Elsie moved slower than usual that morning, not from weariness, but because it felt like the day asked for it. She dressed in layers, the way older women often do when the season can't decide its mind, and her cardigan sleeves were pushed to her elbows by the time she reached the front door. Frankie was still asleep, a small hill beneath the patchwork blanket in the little bedroom at the top of the stairs. He'd stayed up longer than usual, drawing new ideas by candlelight. Elsie had found a crumpled plan on the kitchen floor just before dawn, something about a pulley system and a biscuit tin. She'd smoothed it gently and tucked it into the drawer beside her recipe cards. The air outside had a peculiar smell, wet iron and distant toast. Elsie couldn't place it, but it tugged at a memory she couldn't quite reach. Across the street, the shop door was already ajar, and the faint clatter of Ruth moving books could be heard in between the soft scuff of Samuel's slippered steps. It was a comfort, that sound, the kind of domestic rustle that grounded the world when everything else felt too loose. She walked slowly, hands clasped behind her back, and stopped when she reached the bookshop window. The paper girl was still there, of course, her gaze tilted forever upward, but now there was a new addition. Right beside the paper boat Frankie had folded sat a small silver button, polished so bright it gleamed in the morning haze. No note. No explanation. Just the button. Next to it someone had left a bell. A tiny one, no bigger than a coin, with a delicate crack along its side that suggested it had rung once, beautifully, and maybe could still ring again. Elsie leaned in to look closer, her breath misting the glass just enough to blur the words beneath the objects. "Hope comes in strange clothes," someone had scrawled in charcoal on a scrap of newspaper, tucking it behind the marble. She stood there for a long moment, letting the scene settle into her like a new verse added to a long-loved song. The window had become something more than display. It was part altar, part confession box, part message board for those too shy to speak aloud. A place where people said things with paper and ink they couldn't say with mouths. Inside the shop, Ruth looked up and saw her. She smiled, held up a teacup, and mouthed something that looked like 5 minutes. Elsie nodded, tapped her watch, and turned back toward home. But before she crossed the street, she paused at the corner where the drain pipe curved into the ground. Tucked into the curve was a stone painted with a tiny house. It looked like Frankie's work, though the brush lines were finer than usual. A collaboration, perhaps. Another shared secret between the children and the rain. She slipped it into her pocket. Back home, Frankie had stirred, wandering into the kitchen with his socks half on and hair stubborn in all directions. He opened the icebox out of habit, found nothing new, and closed it again with the resigned grace of a boy used to small disappointments. He rubbed his eyes and sat heavily at the table. "I think I'm going to make a memory box," he said, voice still thick with sleep, "for everything that doesn't fit anywhere else." Elsie poured tea, added a spoonful of barley and passed it to him with a smile. "What would you put in it?" He thought for a moment, sipping noisily. The biscuit tin plans, the stone from the alley, one of Ruth's sugar cubes, maybe the broken glider, things that felt important but never had a job. "That sounds like a very good idea," she said. They spent the morning gathering. Frankie fetched a shoebox from under the bed, one with a torn corner and faded writing along the lid. Inside they placed the painted stone, the pulley sketch, a feather he claimed had floated in during the blackout, and a bit of ribbon from a parcel Nora had once brought by. Each item was folded or wrapped or tucked in with care. By midday the box was half full and resting on the windowsill, soaking in the sun like a sleeping cat. At the shop, Ruth was hosting a new ritual she called the Noon Whisper. At exactly 12 o'clock, she invited anyone nearby to step inside and read the window poems aloud. Not loudly, not performatively, just soft enough that the words filled the air like steam from a fresh pot of tea. Today, 4 people came. A schoolteacher with a lisp, a seamstress with a cough, a boy with one shoe, and Nora still in her work apron streaked with dust. They read in turns, passing a single candle between them. And when they were done, Ruth gave them each a toffee she'd hidden in a drawer since Christmas. The boy cried when he tasted his, not out of sadness, but because it was the first sweet he'd had in weeks. That afternoon, Elsie sat with Nora in the small garden behind the house. The washing line was still, and the rosebush had dropped 3 more petals into the soil. They watched a bee try to make sense of a daisy made from paper. It gave up after a while and flew off, drunk on confusion. "I think I'd like to leave something in the window," Elsie said suddenly. Nora raised her eyebrows. "A poem?" "No," she said, smiling. "A spoon? Just a simple one. One of the old ones with the chip in the handle. It's not much use anymore, but it served a lot of people. James used to stir his tea with it. I think it's earned a rest." Nora reached over and squeezed her hand. By the time the evening arrived, soft and golden, the window held the spoon. It had been polished to a shine and tied with a thin blue ribbon. Next to it sat a folded page with just one sentence. This stirred more than sugar. No name, no signature. And as the street grew quiet again, as pots were scrubbed and beds were turned down, as the kettle sang and the curtain edges trembled in the dusk, the shop window glowed like a memory, not of something past, but of something present, something still happening even now. The house was quiet again that night, but not with the hush of sleep. It was the sort of quiet that settles just before a thought forms, a space between words where something begins to stir. Elsie had finished her tea and tucked the spoon ribbon carefully back into the drawer. She had not left it in the window after all, not because she changed her mind, but because it had become too precious in her hands once she'd tied the ribbon. The gesture had done its work, even if the object never left the house. That, she had learned, was the strange arithmetic of wartime. The meaning of things shifted not in their use, but in how they were offered. Frankie had gone to bed early, not from tiredness, but because he wanted to dream about flying. He'd announced this over a boiled potato and a half slice of jam, stating plainly that if he was asleep by 8, the flying dreams came quicker. He had brushed his teeth with water that tasted slightly of metal and climbed the narrow stairs without argument. Elsie had listened as the floorboards creaked under his careful steps, then waited until the rustle of blankets told her he was cocooned in the safe world he had built from stories and inventions. But tonight, Elsie didn't follow her usual pattern. She didn't climb the stairs to lay out tomorrow's socks or check the weathering at the corner window. She didn't wind the mantel clock or straighten the photos on the sideboard. Instead, she pulled a shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the garden, where the washing line drooped gently under its own memory. The sky was cloudless for once, a rare thing in a city so often muted by haze and smoke. Above her, stars pricked holes through the velvet darkness, silent and aloof. She moved toward the back fence slowly, letting her fingers trail along the tops of the cabbages and the rosemary bush that had outlived every planting chart she'd ever read. In the far corner, nestled near the compost heap, was a small stool she'd once used to reach the high shelves in the pantry. It had lived outside now for nearly 2 years, and its paint had peeled into lovely patterns. She sat on it now and looked up. Somewhere to the west, a train hummed in the distance, too far to see but close enough to hear the metal rhythm of its wheels. Closer still, a fox barked once, then fell silent again. The city breathed around her, not loudly, but with presence. There was always something beating under the surface in London, even when the bombs didn't fall. A collective pulse, maybe, or just the memory of thousands of shoes tapping against stone. She stayed like that for some time, until her fingers grew cold and her back began to protest the stool's warped edge. She was just about to stand when she heard it. A soft knock. Not on the front door. On the side gate. That old gate hardly ever opened anymore. It groaned on its hinges, like something waking from a long nap. Elsie hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to call out or wait. But the knock came again, soft and deliberate. She rose, gathered her shawl tighter, and walked toward it. The gate creaked open as she reached for the latch, and there stood Nora, in boots that looked 2 days tired, and a coat that had seen every season twice over. "I'm sorry," Nora said, her voice a little raw. "I didn't want to wake you. I needed air, and I remembered your rosemary." Elsie stepped aside without a word and let her in. They walked together through the garden, not speaking until they reached the stool. Elsie gestured toward the upturned crate nearby, and Nora sank onto it gratefully. "I couldn't sleep," she said after a while. "Not for any reason I could name. It's not the noise, it's not even the quiet. It's the thinking, I suppose. Some nights my mind forgets how to rest." Elsie nodded slowly. Some nights are like that. They forget how to end. Nora pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, her eyes squinting toward the stars. There's something comforting about knowing you're not the only one awake. They sat together, each lost in separate thoughts, until Nora reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled bit of paper. She didn't hand it over, just held it between her fingers. "It's not a poem," she said. "It's just a list. Things I haven't said. I wrote them down last week. I think I thought I'd post them to myself." "Read it?" Elsie asked, softly. Nora shook her head. "Not yet." They let the silence return, not heavy this time, just gentle. The garden around them breathed in dew and darkness. Somewhere a neighbour coughed. Somewhere further, glass chimed gently in a breeze. But here, in this little patch of world, time had loosened its grip. There was no clock ticking, no kettle whistling, just the thrum of night and two women who understood each other without explanation. Eventually Nora tucked the paper back into her coat. "Do you think we'll remember all of this?" she asked. Elsie leaned back and looked at the stars again. "No, not all of it, but maybe the important bits. Maybe how it felt. The weight of a blanket, the smell of toast, the laugh that came too late but still mattered. That's what sticks, I think." "I'm afraid of forgetting," Nora whispered. "Then leave it behind for someone else," Elsie replied. "In the window. In the spoon. In a word tucked into a box." Nora smiled. Not a big smile, just the kind that starts slow and fades even slower. They stayed until the cold finally nipped at their fingertips, and the stars began to retreat into dawn. Then they parted without goodbyes, only a look, and the promise of tomorrow folded quietly into their footsteps. Inside, the house had stayed warm. Frankie had not stirred, but his door was cracked slightly, as if he had meant to listen for something and fallen asleep too soon. Elsie paused outside his room, listening to his even breath. Then she stepped into the kitchen and wound the clock, not out of necessity, but to remind it where the night had gone. And in the shop across the street, as morning light began to touch the windows, someone had added a new item, a paper clock, drawn in charcoal, his hands pointing to nowhere in particular. Beneath it a note. "Some nights don't need a time, just a place to wait in." The morning that followed moved like softened butter across toast, warm and deliberate, filling in all the little cracks without rush or resistance. A kind of peace had settled across Mallow Street, the kind people noticed only when they had the time to listen for it. The air was mild, holding the scent of turned soil and cooling chimney bricks, and for the first time in several weeks, no one in the row of houses along the north side lit a fire before breakfast. Whether out of frugality or faith in the weather's whimsy, it didn't matter. The chill wasn't sharp enough to demand flame, and that alone felt like a luxury. Elsie stirred her tea at the kitchen table, not really because it needed stirring, but because the motion was comforting. Across from her, Frankie sat with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a small stack of carefully cut paper squares arranged before him like playing cards. He was constructing what he called a whisper journal, a small handmade book in which he would write things only he could read, but that he hoped someone else would find one day. When asked why he wouldn't just write it in a regular notebook, he had replied with perfect seriousness, "Because whispers deserve their own space." Elsie hadn't argued. She had simply handed him an old shoelace to use as binding and placed a dish of apple slices by his elbow. He had murmured a thank you, barely audible, already lost in the folds of paper and the scratch of pencil. The kettle on the stove had gone quiet, and the house felt full with the kind of silence that didn't press but held. In the corner, the cat from 3 doors down had returned again, nestled on the old armchair as if it had never left. No one owned it exactly, but it rotated houses with a sense of entitlement only felines possessed, always appearing on days when a quiet presence felt like a gift. Across the street, the shop's front window glowed with something new. Not light, though that filtered through as always, but something softer, subtler. A change not in brightness, but in depth. Someone had added a second layer behind the poems, a hanging sheet of translucent cloth with pockets stitched into it like a quilt turned upright. Inside the pockets were objects, not many yet, just a few. A key with a broken tooth, a button shaped like a star, a piece of string neatly coiled, and in the centre, nestled in its own small square, was a note written in tidy script. The window beneath the window, for what can't be said out loud. Ruth's idea, no doubt, or Samuel's quiet influence. Elsie stared at it from the porch, the corner of her tea towel still damp from wiping the railing. She imagined what she might place in one of those pockets. A pine cone, maybe, from the tree that used to grow behind her childhood home, a bit of lace from her mother's apron, a train ticket stub from the day she'd first arrived in London, suitcase too large and dreams far too small. By midday the street had caught wind of the addition. The shop was fuller than usual, not bustling exactly. No place on Mallow Street ever truly bustled, but humming with a slow current of visitors. Children came in pairs, clutching treasures they'd kept hidden beneath floorboards and in biscuit tins. A girl with a freckled nose pressed a tiny dried flower into one pocket, whispering, "This was from the last walk I had with her." A boy with glasses too large for his face offered a marble with a chip. "It still rolls straight," he said with pride. Nora came just after 2, her arms full of folded laundry she'd offered to help sort. She stayed longer than necessary, sipping a weak lemon tea and watching the window as people drifted in and out. She didn't speak much that afternoon, but when she left, Elsie noticed a small envelope had appeared in one of the new pockets, unmarked but sealed with red wax. A secret, perhaps, or a goodbye. Back at home, Frankie had finished the cover of his whisper journal. He had written one sentence so far. "The sky is different when you look up on purpose." Oh. Elsie read it while folding dishcloths and smiled to herself. He'd always been like that. Not fanciful, really, just aware in ways that most people never learn to be. He noticed when a bird paused on the sill for longer than usual. He felt when a room had changed temperature without anyone opening a window. She had often wondered if it came from James's side, that particular sensitivity. Or perhaps it came from the war, from needing to grow up in a world where detail sometimes meant safety. That evening the sun took its time sinking. It moved through the windows like honey, thick and slow, draping itself across rugs and tabletops, setting the glassware alight with a quiet brilliance. Elsie sat by the stove shelling the last of the peas from the allotment, her hands working by a memory while her eyes watched the shifting light. Frankie was on the floor with a handful of buttons, organising them into constellations. "If Orion were a coat," he said, "these would be his stars." He held up 3 dark buttons in a straight line, his voice low with awe. Elsie nodded, and his belt would hold everything together. Later, just after supper, they walked to the shop. It had become a habit, these evening visits, not planned but anticipated. The window display was busier now, but not cluttered. Ruth had an eye for arrangement, and the poem still led the viewer's eye gently from left to right. The objects in the second layer had multiplied, each pocket now holding some small whisper of memory. A cork from a celebration long forgotten, a string of faded beads, a drawing of a bird in flight, done in pencil so light it nearly disappeared. Frankie stood for a long time in front of the window, fingers pressed to the glass. Then he pulled something from his coat pocket, a button from James's old uniform, one Elsie had given him weeks ago for safekeeping. He looked up at her. "May I?" he asked. She hesitated, just a breath, then nodded. Ruth appeared from behind the curtain and opened the door without speaking. Frankie stepped inside, and a few minutes later the button had a place. Second row, 3rd pocket from the left. Beneath it, he tucked a note that read, It kept his coat closed, even when the world was falling apart. That night, after the candles had been blown out and the cat had settled on the windowsill once more, Elsie lay awake longer than usual. Not out of worry, but out of fullness. There was something about that window now, that layered quilt of quiet confessions, that made her feel less alone than she'd felt in years. The war still growled beyond their reach, sure enough, but inside this little pocket of the city something else had taken root. Something stitched with paper and buttons and ribbon, with poems and feathers and whispered truths. And in the silence of her room she whispered a truth of her own, just to the ceiling, just to the dark. "I still miss you, James." And somewhere across the street the marble still caught the light. The next morning was one of those grey London days where even the colour grey itself seemed unsure of its mood. The light wasn't dim enough to be sombre, nor bright enough to suggest any joy was on the way. It simply hovered, as if waiting for someone to make a decision. Elsie opened the curtains just enough to see the sky and left them there, half drawn like a theatre that hadn't decided whether the show would go on. The street outside lay still, damp patches dotting the pavement from an earlier drizzle. Somewhere nearby, the soft metallic squeak of a bicycle wheel drifted through the air, followed by the sound of a voice singing something too faint to catch. Elsie made tea slowly, carefully, as though it were the most important task she'd ever been given. She measured the leaves out with her smallest spoon, the one that had lost its twin long ago, and set the kettle over the flame like it needed a ceremony. Her hands moved with the steady rhythm that age brings, not hurried but never idle. She worked in motions passed down through decades, through generations. The quiet clink of porcelain was enough to fill the kitchen with a kind of dignity, the music of care made tangible. Frankie came in barefoot, carrying his whisper journal under one arm and a folded page from the newspaper in the other. His face bore the sleepy pride of someone who had just come up with something he knew mattered. He climbed into his usual chair and set the paper down with care. "I think the objects are telling a story," he said plainly, nodding toward the bookshop window across the street. "Not like a normal story, more like pieces of one. If you line them up just right in your mind, they talk." Elsie raised her eyebrows as she poured the tea, tilting the pot just enough to catch the golden thread of the liquid. "And what are they saying today?" "They're waiting," Frankie said, tracing a line on the tabletop with his finger. "Not just for people, for the next piece, for something that fits, like a coat without buttons, or a sentence missing a word." She passed him his cup and gave a small thoughtful nod. Sometimes the best stories do that. They wait for the reader to fill in the rest. They sipped in silence for a time. The window caught their eyes again and again without them realising it. A new object had appeared overnight. Tucked into the fourth pocket from the bottom was a single glove. It was wool, the kind knitted in haste and hope, too small for most grown hands, too worn for a child. It had holes in the fingertips and a loose thread trailing down like an unravelled question. Attached to it by a safety pin was a note in block letters. It was never about the pair. It was about the warmth it gave while it lasted. Elsie felt something catch in her throat as she read the words, even from across the street. Some moments during the war reached in and stirred you without asking permission. It wasn't the bombs or the broadcast that did it. It was the glove left behind, the half-used soap, the one photograph turned to face the wall. Small things that told bigger truths. Later that day, Nora stopped by with a tin of lentils and a strip of curtain fabric rolled into a neat bundle. She didn't speak right away, just handed over the tin and gestured towards the back step where they often sat when the weather allowed. Elsie followed, tying her shawl loosely at the neck, and they settled in without ceremony. The clouds had begun to shift slightly, creating soft rivers of light that wandered across the cobblestones. The cat returned again, this time curling between Nora's ankles as if summoned. "I found it in a drawer," Nora said eventually, holding up the fabric. "It used to be part of the curtain in my mum's front room. I think I was 5 when she sewed it. She didn't know much about patterns, but she could stitch a hem like magic. There was always light coming through it in the morning. Even when the glass cracked, that fabric just held it." Elsie took it gently, turning it over in her hands. It was soft from age, edges frayed just enough to show its honesty. She nodded. "Do you want to put it in the window?" Nora hesitated, then shook her head. "Not yet. I'm still talking to it, but I will." They sat for a while longer, letting the rhythm of the street wash over them, the sound of shoes scuffing pavement, a radio playing from an open window, the faint clip of scissors from someone trimming flowers next door. These were the sounds they clung to, the ones they wanted the world to hear, long after the sirens had gone silent. That evening, as twilight painted the buildings in lavender and blue, the window display changed again. Ruth had added a new row of pockets. The second layer was growing, but it never felt crowded. It simply grew the way trees do, reaching when needed, settling where allowed. Frankie stood by it with a small wooden spool in his hand, its thread long gone, the wood smooth from years of turning. He pressed it gently into one of the bottom pockets and stepped back. "I found it in the alley behind Mr. Goodwin's," he said. "I think it's from someone who was making something once but never finished. So I thought, maybe someone else could start again." Samuel appeared beside him, placing a finger to the glass in acknowledgement. "A good place for waiting things," he murmured. And when Elsie arrived just after, she brought something folded in brown paper. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing an old apron, soft blue, nearly grey with age, the edges embroidered with tiny, clumsy stitches she had made as a child. It was her mother's. It had hung behind the pantry door for over 30 years. She pressed it gently into the top left pocket and whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. That night, the window didn't just glow, it shimmered. The lamplight inside the shop caught on the buttons and thread and paper corners, casting soft reflections onto the glass like tiny constellations. The poem seemed to breathe. The glove rested with dignity. The wooden spool sat quietly, its story no longer unfinished but paused. In the rooms beyond the window, the people of Mallow Street moved gently. Some read by candlelight, some stared at the ceiling and let the stories they didn't yet understand play across their minds. And some, like Elsie and Frankie, sat together on a worn rug, sharing the warmth of a single quilt. Not because the room was cold, but because closeness had become its own kind of shelter. And in the window beneath the window, the stories continued to grow. The sound came softly at first, like memory brushing up against the present. Elsie had almost missed it, buried as it was beneath the kettle's quiet bubbling and the steady tick of the mantel clock. But once she noticed, it wouldn't leave her alone. It was a hum, low and tuneless, with the kind of rhythm that came not from music but from motion. She looked up from her sewing and tilted her head slightly. The hum repeated, then paused, then returned, just under the breath of the house, like the floorboards themselves had begun remembering something. She set the needle down carefully and rose from her chair. Frankie had gone to the back garden to build a contraption that involved a tin lid, some wire, and a pair of Nora's discarded boots. Elsie didn't ask questions any more about these experiments. They were part of the music of the house now. But the hum was different. It was old. It came from beneath the hallway rug, the thick one with the faded roses that James had always said was too nice for shoes. She walked slowly, her slippers silent against the floor, and knelt beside the rug. For a long moment, she didn't move. She just listened. The hum was still there, faint, repeating, like someone humming under their breath as they worked. She pressed her palm to the boards and felt nothing. No vibration, no warmth. But the sound stayed, a lullaby almost, wordless. It reminded her of the songs her mother used to sing while scrubbing the copper or peeling potatoes, not for the sake of music, but to keep company with herself. She lifted the edge of the rug and found what she hadn't expected to find. Nothing. Just the same old floorboards, scratched and stained with time. But still the hum continued. She smiled softly, more curious than concerned. Some things in a house were never meant to be solved, only understood. That evening, as the sun leaned lower, and the wind carried smells of soot and blossom together, like an unlikely marriage, she told Frankie about the hum. He had just returned from the garden with grass on his knees and mud on his cheek, proudly declaring the boots now capable of walking short distances on their own, so long as you whispered encouragement. When she told him about the his eyes widened with the seriousness only a child could offer. It's the house, he said simply. It's singing to say thank you. For what? For noticing. Elsie couldn't argue with that. They left the rug rolled back just slightly, a little triangle of bare floor exposed, like the house had something it wanted to remember in peace. Across the street, the window display had taken on a new shape. Ruth and Samuel had rearranged the pockets, not removing anything, but shifting them as if to allow the stories to breathe differently. Some had moved higher, closer to the paper girl's gaze. Others now nestled near the bottom, where children could reach them without lifting their arms. And a new object had appeared, a simple string of bells. Not shiny, not uniform, some larger, some too small to chime properly. But together they hung like punctuation at the end of a poem. Beneath them a note read, "For when words need music." Frankie stood with his nose almost pressed to the glass, watching the bells tremble gently each time the shop door opened or closed. Then he turned to Elsie, eyes bright. "I want to write a song for the window," he said. "What kind of song?" "A quiet one that doesn't need to be sung, just known." He spent the rest of the afternoon writing, not with a pen, but with string. He wove pieces through old buttons and bits of paper, each knot placed with intention. When Elsie asked what it said, he just smiled and told her, "It's not a song you hear with ears. You hear it with remembering." That night, long after the lamps had been blown out and the street was soft with quiet, the hum returned. It was still low, still almost imaginary, but it wrapped itself around the corners of the house like a scarf. Elsie lay in bed with one hand on her chest and the other resting on the quilt, listening to nothing and everything all at once. She thought about James, about the way he used to tap his foot softly when thinking. She thought about her mother, and the scent of lemon soap, and the time she had once sung to a bird until it fell asleep in her palm. And she thought about the floorboards, and the way the house knew what needed to be kept alive. The following morning, Elsie and Frankie brought their song to the shop. Ruth greeted them with a nod and led them to the window, where a space had been left open in the second layer, as if someone had known something new was coming. Frankie unrolled his creation, a stringed circle made from wire and ribbon, buttons and folded paper, threaded through with one red shoelace and tied at the bottom with a loop. He held it gently, then passed it to Ruth. "It sings when you look at it," he whispered. Ruth said nothing. She simply hung it gently in the open space and stepped back. The morning light hit it just so, and the paper flaps fluttered like breath. Outside, a breeze picked up, lifting the edges of coats and skirts, tugging gently at the edges of the day. The bells in the window trembled. The song string danced. And for just a moment it felt as if the stories in the glass leaned closer to listen. The wind came differently that morning, not the pushy kind that slapped at shutters or made the letterbox rattle, but something more like a whisper turned into motion. It rolled down Mallow Street in long, sweeping sighs, nudging the curtains just enough to make them breathe and lifting the corner of rugs as if asking permission to come in. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but it brought with it a feeling. Not news, not warning, just the quiet announcement that something had shifted. The sky stayed low and soft, painted with a thin veil of white that refused to break into rain. It was a day for memory, Elsie thought as she stood at the window with her second cup of tea cooling in her hands, and not just hers. Frankie had woken with tangled hair and a purpose too big for speech. He'd slipped a note beneath her toast plate that morning, written in bright blue crayon and folded twice, like something important from a post office that only existed in his mind. It read, "Today is the remembering day. Don't ask what that means yet. You'll know." She hadn't asked. She had simply tied her cardigan closed, slipped her shoes on without socks, and left the front door ajar as if the house itself might want to follow along. Across the street, the bookshop already had its door propped open, and the faint scent of lavender oil and old pages drifted into the air like a familiar perfume. There was a hum, not like the mysterious one in her floorboards, but the hum of people moving with quiet purpose. Something was being prepared, but no one had explained what. At the window, the song string Frankie had made was swaying gently in the wind. It didn't tangle or twist. It simply moved the way trees do when they're listening. The pockets below it looked fuller than the day before. A knitted square, a playing card, a spoon tied with a bow. The glove was still there. And now beside it someone had tucked in a single coin, dulled by time but held upright by 2 pins. Beneath it, a note. He kept it for luck. I keep it for him. By mid-morning, people had started arriving with small parcels wrapped in cloth or folded into envelopes, none marked with names, all offered with that same quiet reverence people reserve for birthdays and gravesides. Samuel was arranging them without comment, his hands as steady as the first page of a good book. Ruth was scribbling in a notebook, the kind with a soft cover and frayed edge, her pen moving not in sentences, but in phrases, the language of someone catching thoughts before they disappeared. Frankie arrived with his boots only half laced, dragging a paper kite he had made from ration sheets and 2 branches. He planted it near the door, where it tilted gently in the wind. Elsie stepped in and took it all in without needing to ask. This was the remembering day, not a holiday, a ceremony. Just a shared moment that had appeared on the wind, passed from one mind to another, carried in a look, a whispered plan, the weight of something felt but not named. Nora came just after noon, with an old shoebox under one arm and her coat buttoned wrong. She handed the box to Ruth and walked away without a word. No one followed. Inside the shop the air was different. The usual creak of floorboards, the occasional murmur of a customer, had given way to something even softer. People moved as if in a museum, pausing to read notes, to touch the glass with fingertips so light they barely left a mark. The second layer of the window had become a third now, a third row of pockets stitched from remnants and hope, a kind of quilt made out of other people's silences. The blue ribbon from Elsie's apron was now tied in a bow around a tiny tin soldier. Next to it was a folded map, and beside that a single shoelace knotted and fraying. Frankie leaned close to the display and whispered something Elsie couldn't hear. Then he stepped back and turned to her with that same bright-eyed look he got when he'd finished something that mattered. "It's done now," he said. "What is?" "The memory. We've built it. It's not in our heads anymore." Elsie smiled and wrapped her hand gently around his. They stood like that for some time, watching the breeze play its small music through the strings and papers, the window glowing not with light, but with story. Around them, others began to leave their offerings, a chalk drawing, a key, a curl of hair, a page torn from a book with just one line underlined. She waited by the kettle until it sang. Evening came quietly, as if not wanting to disturb what had been made. The street lamps flickered on one by one, and still no one moved to close the shop. Samuel lit a single oil lamp, placed it near the window, and stood back. The glow spilled out like breath, casting the hanging pockets in long shadows. Outside the wind lifted again, just once, and this time one of the bells chimed gently, not loudly, just enough to be known. Elsie and Frankie walked home slowly. Their shadows stretched long and kind across the cobblestones. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The remembering day had filled something in both of them, a quiet stitch in the fabric of everything that had ever felt missing. And when they reached their door, the wind tugged once more, lifting the hem of Elsie's coat and spinning the paper kite into the porch light. It fluttered once, then settled. On the back, someone, perhaps Frankie, perhaps not, had written in blue crayon, "Some memories don't fade, they just wait to be shared." That night, long after the kettle had cooled and the chairs were turned inward, Elsie found herself standing again by the hallway rug. The hum had returned, quiet and persistent. She didn't lift the edge this time. She just listened, her eyes half closed, her mind half full. The floorboards whispered again, the song in their grain stretching back further than even she remembered, and she let it sing. The following morning brought with it a kind of quiet that didn't belong to any weather in particular. It wasn't the hush before rain or the stillness that comes with frost. It was quieter than that, deeper, like the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. Elsie woke to it slowly, the way one wakes from a dream, too soft to remember and too kind to forget. She didn't rush. The covers remained a little longer around her shoulders. The pillow retained the shape of her cheek, and the room held the low light as if it had grown fond of it. She rose eventually, slippers slipping over wood like sighs, and moved through the house with the grace of someone not late for anything. In the kitchen, Kettle felt warm even before the flame touched it, as if it too had absorbed the stillness. She brewed her tea in silence, not for lack of thought, but because some mornings deserved no commentary. Outside, the street was mostly empty. A few curtains moved. A cat darted from one fence post to another. The usual chorus of footsteps and distant radios had not yet begun. It was a morning for memory again, but softer this time, less like a call and more like a murmur. Frankie appeared from the hallway wrapped in a blanket, dragging his journal behind him. His hair pointed in every direction, and his face bore the creases of sleep still heavy on his skin. He yawned without shame, then climbed onto the kitchen bench and rested his chin on the table. "I think the window's full now," he said, not lifting his head. Elsie poured his tea and nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just resting." He lifted his journal and began drawing something with the side of his pencil. Long lines, a shape that looked like a path or a thread. What happens when it's too full to hold more? "Then we build something new," she answered, "or we carry it inside us for a while." Across the street, the shop stood quiet. The bell had been taken down the night before, and the pockets in the window had not changed. They didn't need to. For the first time, the display didn't ask for anything. It simply offered itself, complete in its incompleteness. Ruth had placed a small lamp on the floor behind the glass, not lit, just present. It looked like the kind of lamp that once belonged to someone's attic, the kind that waited decades to be remembered. Its brass was dulled, but its glass was clean, and the way it sat, tilted slightly as if listening, made it seem almost alive. Elsie walked over around mid-morning, her coat unbuttoned, and her pockets full of nothing in particular. She stood outside the shop for a long while before Ruth came to the door, wiping her hands on a rag, the scent of lemon oil trailing behind her. "Doesn't feel finished," Ruth said quietly. Elsie smiled, not at the window but at Ruth. "Maybe it's not meant to be." They stood together, watching the way the light from the sky touched the edges of the lamp. No flicker, no reflection, just the steady presence of something that had waited long enough to be seen. Inside, Samuel moved without sound, adjusting shelves, dusting corners, the kind of work that never ends but never really needs to. Later that afternoon, Nora arrived. She didn't bring anything, not this time. She simply walked to the shop and placed her hand gently on the glass. Then she turned, eyes softer than usual, and said, "I remembered something I hadn't in years. The way my sister used to braid my hair before school. She'd hum while doing it. I hadn't thought of that in decades." Elsie touched her arm. "That's what the window does. It hums for us, when we've forgotten how." Evening came with a golden hush. The air felt thicker, as though the day had meant more than it let on. Lamps flickered on, one by one, across Mallow Street, but no one closed their curtains quite yet. The light deserved to linger. Frankie set his whisper journal on the windowsill at home, open to a blank page, as if waiting for something to write itself. He looked older that night, not in his face, but in the way he carried the silence. Not burdened by it, but familiar with it. Elsie sat beside him and brushed a curl from his forehead. "Do you know why we keep stories?" she asked softly. He thought for a long time before answering. "So we don't disappear." She kissed the top of his head. "And so the ones we love don't either." That night, after the tea had gone cold and the floorboards had gone still, she stood by the front window and watched the lamp in the shop glow quietly. It had been lit just after sunset. No announcement, no ceremony, just a soft flame in an old lamp casting a circle of warmth onto the sidewalk. People slowed as they passed it. Some paused. A few left handprints on the glass. Elsie didn't say anything. She didn't move. She simply watched. And as the lamp flickered once, then steadied, she felt something in her chest loosen. Something she hadn't even noticed was tight. Behind her, Frankie whispered something to the darkness. In the window, the lamp listened. The street didn't look different the next morning, but somehow everything had changed. The cobbles still held last night's rain like secrets in their cracks. The fences still leaned the way they always had, slightly crooked from years of weather, and quiet hands adjusting them back again. The washing lines still moved faintly, even when no wind stirred. Yet something beneath the skin of Mallow Street felt shifted. Not broken or remade, just softer maybe, woven more tightly. The way cloth feels different after it has been worn and held and loved. Elsie woke with a kind of ache that wasn't from her bones but from the space between days. She stayed in bed a little longer, not from tiredness but from reverence. Outside, the lamp in the bookshop, window still glowed faintly, though the sun had risen fully now, and its light was no longer needed, but it stayed lit. Perhaps because someone had forgotten to blow it out, or perhaps because it wasn't ready to rest just yet. She dressed slowly, choosing her thicker cardigan even though the weather didn't quite call for it. Some days were cardigan days, no matter the season. Downstairs, the kettle waited patiently, as it always did, and the floorboards greeted her with their familiar creak beneath her heels. She stood in the doorway a moment before reaching for the teapot, her fingers brushing the handle like a greeting. It was in those small gestures, those tiny moments between thought and motion, that she found the world had grown richer. Frankie was already awake. He had built a tower of buttons and thimbles beside his breakfast and was now drawing a ladder next to it in his whisper journal. He looked up when she entered and smiled sleepily. There was no rush to the morning, no urgency in the tea or the toast. The air inside the house was thick with gentleness. Later they visited the shop together. No one had asked them to, and nothing new had been promised. But the window had become part of their routine now. Not a display, a conversation. Ruth was outside sweeping the front step, the broom belly touching the stone, more of a movement than a task. She looked up and nodded, her face softer than usual, as though the night had smoothed its edges. Samuel sat just inside the door, reading aloud from a book whose cover had long since worn away. His voice floated out like the smell of tea, curling into the morning and mixing with the dust. The window was unchanged, or rather perfectly changed. It no longer grew with new things, not for now. The stories inside had settled into each other, like children who'd fallen asleep during a game. The gloves, the string, the bells, the poems. The lamp still flickered, barely. And Elsie wondered for a moment if it was waiting for one last breath before dimming. But it didn't. It simply stayed. Frankie placed a final note in one of the bottom pockets. A simple scrap of brown paper, folded twice and tied with twine. Inside, just 2 words in his careful slanted script. Still here. Elsie didn't ask what it meant. She didn't need to. Some things are written more for the act than the audience. They stood there together, hand in hand, for a long while, watching the stories breathe behind the glass. People passed quietly, a few stopping, some just pausing for a moment. No one spoke loudly, no one rushed. The day had taken on the rhythm of memory, slow, kind, present. That evening, as twilight bled into the buildings and the first lamps were lit again, Elsie made supper with the radio on low, and the hub of the windows cracked open. Frankie set the table without being asked, placing the spoons with extra care and smoothing the tablecloth twice. Outside, the trees rustled with the last of the warm breeze, and inside, the house glowed with that special kind of light that only comes when everything is exactly where it should be. After they'd eaten and the dishes were drying by the sink, they sat in the front room, each with a book, but neither really reading. The quiet held them, not heavy, just enough. The cat returned, hopping up onto the windowsill and watching the street below like it belonged to it. And in the corner the old floorboard hummed again, faint but steady. The same song, the same pulse. The house was still singing, not loudly, just enough to remind them. Elsie closed her eyes for a moment and listened. She thought of James and of her mother, and of the stories they'd shared, even the ones never spoken aloud. She thought of Nora, of Ruth and Samuel, of Frankie's soft laughter, and the way he leaned in when he listened. She thought of the window full now, but never truly full, and she thought of the kettle, singing quietly on the stove, the sound as constant as breath. It was true what Frankie had written. They were still here, not unchanged, not untouched, but still here. And so the kettle sang. And outside, beneath the glass and the lamp and the 100 tiny pockets of memory, the story slept, not gone, just resting.